So early on, that story I just told you, Eddie, I haven't told anybody ever.
Hello there, it's me, Dr. Ed, here from the Richard and Dr. Ed show. This is just a brief introduction to say that this is my conversation with Dr. Jack Kruse. Dr. Jack Kruse is a neurosurgeon and quantum biologist, extremely smart man who has come up with theories and practices that he uses with his patients and has done so for a long time. This conversation that I had with him is fairly high level. We get into some clinical details that may not be relevant for the majority of listeners, but there's plenty of other interviews with Jack available on YouTube and on Spotify and wherever else you listen to your podcasts. His page, Dr. Jack Kruse, he's on Instagram, he has a website, he has a blog on Patreon. So I recommend you check all of those things out. I will say that some of the topics that we get into are or can be construed as controversial, but if you actually listen to what's said and then question it for yourself, that is all Jack is asking for. Obviously, none of the topics we discuss in this podcast are meant to replace medical advice from your own doctor. And I do recommend that if you hear anything that does sound interesting in the discussion that we have, you should discuss that with your doctor and get their opinion on it, because it might be something that they've never heard of. It might be something that they've had. It's always worth having a conversation when you can with your doctor. So with that, I'll leave you to enjoy the conversation. Please comment, like, and subscribe and all of those good things. And if you're just interested in the audio version, you can listen to this over on the Richard and Dr. Ed show, and you can find that on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, wherever you like. Enjoy the show. So, hello, it's just me today, and today I really want to welcome Dr. Jack Kruse to the podcast. Thank you so much, Jack, for your time today.
Hey, no problem, anytime.
I probably won't win any prizes for this, but I have to say I've listened to the Huberman and Rick Rubin podcast maybe 5 or 6 times, and considering the length of it, I've picked up a fairly large number of golden nuggets. And it still gets me the end of the first episode where you use the word incalculable in terms of the impact of the amount of teaching that we have in medical education that we know is likely not true, or at least not completely true. And as my kind of life goal is very similar to yours in that I really want to change how medicine is practiced for the better, I suppose I want to lead off with, how do we start to change medicine?
This is the part you're probably not going to like. My belief is twofold. I think most of the change is going to come from the outside. I think it's very rare that change comes from the inside. I would tell you as a physician, just think about what happened to Semmelweis. And then the flip side, from your countrymen, think about John Snow. John Snow, who was an outsider, figured out how the pump, on the street was the source of cholera. So I would say the second part of my answer would be what Buckminster Fuller always says. If you want to change a paradigm, the best thing to do is burn it down. I will tell you that I also have, probably somewhat of a bad reputation with people, because I will burn them down when I think they're leading people the wrong way. And a lot of people think that is a character flaw in me, and I don't. I actually think that I'm doing the public a service. And, I say this, Eddie, with some heaviness in my heart. I did that during the COVID issue, and because I knew there was a lot of bad information out there. Like, for example, not to pound on this guy because I know you're from the UK, but think about what Asim Malhotra is going through. First, he supported, the vaccination. Then one of his family members gets injured. Now he's the champion for it. While I laud the fact that he's willing to come out and speak about it. I'm still pissed off with him that he didn't get it before. Why? I got it before. Why didn't he get it before? And that goes to your point. It's because the paradigm that we're in, we always make the assumption, or we always lead that what we're doing is correct. And in fact, if doctors would go back and look at that oath that we all take, really carefully read it and assimilate it, you'll begin to realize that maybe I'm not an asshole. Maybe I take that oath to heart, and I want to burn bridges down that need to be burned down, because my belief, since I'm inside the paradigm, maybe on the edge of it, holding on to the rim, I want to point out to people where the sacred cows are and why they need to be burned. And I think when you understand that perspective, and I always tell people, Eddie, that it's the mark of an educated mind to take something you fundamentally do not believe, examine it for yourself, do your due diligence, and decide. I said that in the Huberman podcast. If you remember, most of the things that I found out about the leptin prescription in the beginning, I didn't believe. I had to actually ideate the idea and then execute it before it made difference. And if you want to know the truth, it still didn't register to me when it worked on me. I had to do it on my son and then my nephew. And when I saw it work on them, I was like, okay, I may have something here. And then I started to do it on my patients. And I didn't do it on all my patients. I just did it on the patients that were like, look, doc, whatever you did, help me out. I said, okay, this is all I need you to do. And then they started getting better. And then I started to notice that diseases that had no neurosurgical basis, that they also had as comorbidities, also started to get better. And that's when I got really, really interested. That's when I said, you know what? I need to do something about this. And the probably the key germinal moment for me was one of my good friends, who's a gastroenterologist. His name's Don Lazis. He's retired now. He had a very specific problem with a patient that had eosinophilic esophagitis, which, is an autoimmune condition that's very difficult to deal with. Most people don't have an answer. And this person had spent a whole bunch of money in the United States, but eventually wound up at the Mayo Clinic. And of course, the Mayo Clinic couldn't do anything with it. So Don sent it to me. He goes, look, Jack, she doesn't have a neurosurgical problem. He said, but can you just tell her what you've kind of been telling everybody else and see if it makes a difference? So I did. And guess what? She got, better. And, the funny thing about the story was, I think this was after Dawn retired. She went to see another gastroenterologist because she was having trouble later on about the distal end of her GI tract. And when they did a scope on her, she had melanosis coli. And she came back to me and she said, what does this mean? I said, well, you're probably getting ready to have fatty liver disease and probably colon cancer unless you change something. She goes, well, what do I need to do? And I said, pull your shirt up. And she goes, why do you want me to pull my shirt up? I said, well, all this stuff that I told you about eosinophilic esophagitis, I said, POMC neurons are in mammals' bellies more than anything else. And she pulled her shirt up and she was white as Marie Antoinette hair before they cut her head off. And she goes, why did you do that? I said, well, that melanosis coli in there, I said, there's papers in the literature that say that it's a pre-malignant condition, but most of the gastroenterologists don't know about it because they didn't read it. It was published in 1997. And she goes, you're kidding me. I said, no. And she goes, well, you're going to talk to the gastroenterologist? And I said, no, I'm a neurosurgeon. I said, the only thing that is in the gut that I deal with is the enteric plexus. And I said, if I go telling another doctor their business, and, Eddie, this, you're a doctor, and you heard what, Rick told everybody about the methylene blue hack between Peter Attia and his surgeon at Stanford. And what did I tell Rick? Don't piss the surgeon off. Well, I'm giving you the same story right now because you asked me, how do you change centralized medicine? So I told the lady, I said, you see your belly? I said, I need that melanin to come to the surface to pull it back out of your gut. I said, you do that, you'll be fine. So over a period of a year, she did that. She went back and had a colonoscopy. A year later, it was gone. Okay. So early on, that story I just told you, Eddie, I haven't told anybody ever. It's the first time. Okay. And I told people there would be implications from the Rubin podcast. I told people that you don't know what you don't know until you know it. And then it's really hard to look away. So my goal has been, because when I did talk about this stuff publicly, it caused a big problem with the paradigm and power. And I realized immediately that I couldn't change the paradigm from inside. So I had to change gears. And thankfully, this gastroenterologist that I told you about, he's the guy that motivated me to put my information on the internet. And he said, Jack, you know that they're not going to let you publish any of this stuff in the literature. It'll get flagged by peer review. They'll do everything possible to block it. I said, and he told me, he said, all of these guys are in the pocket of big pharma that do peer review. He goes, there's no way. And if you remember the original story of how I hurt my knee and figured all this out, that person was trying to get me to out big pharma. That's actually was not my focus when I figured all this out. My focus was like, wait a minute, is there another part of this story to biology that actually we've missed? That to me, as the scientist, the clinician, I was far more interested in that than I was interested in outing big pharma. You know, here we are, you and I talking 20 years later, and you asked me the most powerful question I think you could ask me. Can we change it from the inside? Eddie, my belief is no, for the reasons I just elucidated to you. I'm open to hearing your thoughts on it. I mean, you're in a centralized paradigm on the other side of the pond, but I think many things that are done in the NHS are done the same way they are here. I think Western medicine isn't really Western. I think our model of disease is pretty much everywhere. The places that you have to look for decentralized medicine is like when I did my Vermont 2018 talk with Jeff Leach and Zach Bush. Zach Bush was the centralized doctor that I wanted to take to the woodshed. And Jeff Leach is a PhD researcher, had an open mind, you know, that was feeding the Hazda on the equator, Fanta, Milky Way, antibiotics, and found that their microbiome could tolerate it. But, you know, Zach Bush, to this very day, 5 years later, is still selling garbage to people because he hasn't told them the truth. And I know he knows the truth. And he knows that I know the truth. I tried to out him back then, and that's part of the reason I was never invited back to, you know, to do the Vermont 2019 talk. You have to realize, Eddie, what I'm saying to you, on the surface, it looks like I'm an asshole. But the reason is because I care. I care about getting the story right and telling people the truth, and then letting them make the decision what they have to do. And as I said to Rick, you know, Rick's a good friend of mine, and he said to me, he goes, the message you have is powerful because it's cheap, it's simple. All we have to do is teach people how to get out of their own way, to live the way a mammal's supposed to live. And honestly, that really is the story. It's, you know, as simple as it can be. Now, when you want to know the biology behind it, when you want to know the physics behind it, okay, then I got to split your head open on the Patreon blogs. I got to take you down the rabbit hole, you know, and I've even noticed since I've done the Huberman podcast with Rick, that a lot of people have complained that, well, I couldn't follow it because there's not a lot of details and nothing linked back to it. And I don't think people realize what the goal of that podcast was. It was three guys, one a PhD researcher in a centralized place, a decentralized MD that was furious and has been furious for 2 decades, and then his friend who actually interfaced between me and the centralized paradigm. And we were just having a discussion about that. You weren't intended to know all the details. And I think it's beyond fascinating to me that people feel like I have a duty to, you know, give you all the details. Well, no, I don't. I mean, you have to realize I've been living like this for 20 years. I've been teaching every single patient that comes to me what they need to do. Sometimes I tell them all the details. Many times I don't. You know, it's like Rick said, I don't want to know all the science. He goes, just tell me what I need to do and get out of my way. Rick's happy that he's no longer 400 pounds, that he sleeps good. You know, he's solved his problem with his heart. As far as I'm concerned, he's a happy guy. People love him. So the story for him is he goes on and does what, you know, he's good at doing. And that's really what being a doctor is all about. It's about taking somebody, not letting them go where they want to go. It's actually taking where they ought to go. And that's kind of what I'm doing. When I see a disease that even my specialty doesn't treat, if I think that I can do something to help them, I'll casually mention something. I do this on Twitter. I do it on my forum. I do it everywhere. Some people take it, some people don't. I think my belief is the lower your dopamine level is, the more you think I'm crazy. And I think when people begin to get the first small clinical win, that's when things change. Then they'll say, okay, tell me the next thing. Tell me the next thing. And that's the reason I shared with you the story, is partially because you're a doctor, and also because you understand this eosinophilic esophagitis. That's not my bag of tricks. And another doctor sent it to me. And then I happened to notice, because the power of observation is important. When I looked in her chart, I saw the melanosis coli. I said, okay, I knew the body of Zuckerland was in trouble. You know, I said, she's losing everything here. And it made sense why she was complaining of what the functional medicine guys calls adrenal fatigue. It also made sense why she was having problems with her vagus nerve and the parasympathetic system, because if you understand the wiring diagram, the vagus nerve carries everything up to the transverse mesocolon. From the transverse mesocolon down, it's the sympathetics that travel with the mesenteric arteries that starts right at the body of Zuckerland. So I knew exactly where to go look. And that's the point that I try to make to Huberman in the podcast. Like, what I realize now is I can use the dermatomes and the neural crest derivatives to know where melanin is supposed to be and supposed to go, to really re-engineer the system by thinking as an embryo would. Say, okay, if this problem is here, let me go here. So I'll give you another example. Not to throw another guy under the bus, but we have a famous guy here, paleo carnivore, functional medicine guy. This guy, by training, all he is an acupuncturist. His name's Chris Kresser. I had a patient, this is about 7-8 years ago, who spent $250,000 with Kresser in California. Okay, same exact problem. They had their key problem, Eddie, was a metal detox problem. You know, they had all metal stuff that were in their blood, methyl mercury, things like that. And I looked at the whole workup that was done, and I said, you know, it's kind of amazing to me. I said, did anybody ever talk to you about your skin? Did anybody ever talk to you about, you know, the changes inside your oral mucosa or, you know, in your colon? And the lady said to me, no. I said, well, you don't need any of these supplements. I said, you have a significant melanin problem. So I printed up a couple of papers for her. I said, do you know that melanin absorbs all heavy metals and allows you to detox them through your body? In fact, sometimes the melanosis coli is coming to the surface to get rid of that system, because through the portal circulation, when you're collecting this stuff in your liver, this is a way to detox it. So I gave her papers. I said, do you want to know something? How simple this is? I said, do you know that pigeons, do you know the reason why in London and the reason why in New York City pigeons are dark? Because they're taking all the environmental pollution, putting it in their feathers, and they get rid of it. I said, we do the same thing in our skin. I said, the problem for you is you don't have any more melanin left in your skin. You don't have any more melanin left on the inside of your body, because the environment that you've lived in, which was non-native EMF pollution, because she was an IT engineer from California. I said, you've gotten rid of all your melanin. Now you're falling apart. I said, you need to quit your job, just like the monk who sold his Ferrari, and go move to Mexico for about 12 to 36 months, and you'll get better. Okay, that total consult, Eddie, cost think $56, because she came to see me conventionally, not through my internet business. And she goes, "Are you kidding me?" I said, "No." I said, "This was easy." She goes, "Do you know I spent $250,000?" So the reason I bring this point to you is realize that the guys that are in allopathic medicine, those are the guys that Chris Kresser and the functional medicine guys, they make fun of me and you. But you know what? They don't like anybody talking about their dirty laundry. So you didn't ask me this question, but I'm going to tell you, are they going to solve this problem? No, because you know what? $250,000 is a pretty big nut to walk away from, isn't it? So I think it becomes incumbent on the people that we're taking care of. I think it becomes incumbent on the people we help. I hope that the Rubin podcast, I hope this podcast motivates people out there. We need them to do the heavy lifting. We need them to share this information. I think when you educate your patients so that they know better, the really cool thing about doctors, there is one really cool thing I like about doctors. I'm actually trying to use this tack right now with Peter Attia, who's Huberman's friend. Guys who are alpha males or girls that are alpha females, they don't like when another doctor knows something they don't know. So when you put it out there and you're making it blatantly obvious that they're forgetting some really big factors, they have a choice to make. Do they stay in the matrix or do they decide to extricate them? And that is basically going to tell me how they're going to react. If you want to know the truth, I did the same thing with Huberman. Huberman now knows, everybody knows publicly he knows. Now it's the waiting game. Let's see what he does with the information. You know, is he going to bury it? Will Jack Kruse ever show up on his podcast? I don't know. You know, he said we're going to do it, but, you know, a lot of people have told me a lot of different things that never come to fruition. Why? Because I understand how disruptive this information is. You know, I don't think other people really understand how disruptive it is until you understand the implications from it. So your first question opened up a huge can of worms.
Yes, definitely. There's a lot to think about there. I mean, I knew that the answer would have big implications for my future. There's a few things I wanted to draw back on, if that's okay. One that's just purely out of interest for me. It probably won't interest the listeners, but it just popped up in my head. So the idea of acanthosis nigricans, where you get this pigmentation of the armpits, do you think then that could be the manifestation of melanin migrating from the gut if you have like a GI cancer?
Well, I'm going to shock you further because I'm glad you brought this up. I did a podcast yesterday that just actually went live. They actually put it out. This is from the tech side. I told people, once you understand the really big story, the story that I'm really interested in telling, my next blog is going to tell it. It's going to be Quantum Engineering 43, how we went from chimp to human. One of the things that's really interesting is when you follow the pathway of melanin, you'll also notice there's another mammalian superpower. I haven't really talked about it. You're the first doctor I've talked about it, but this disease you just mentioned is linked to it. We, unlike the chimps and gorillas, have eccrine sweat glands all over our skin. And eccrine sweat glands are actually linked to this melanin story. Remember I told you the story about pigeons, that's how they get rid of heavy metal toxicity. So when some human gets this problem, you by definition, if you're a centralized doc, begin to realize that this person in their body system, some level, has a huge problem with not only heavy metals, but what's the number one heavy metal that nobody thinks about? Deuterium. And I'm getting ready to do something that I haven't done with anybody, dumbing my information down. And I'm going to use two things that I talked about in the Huberman podcast to do it. And this may shock you. I'm going to use a Jim L. Khalili video, and I'm going to use Turing's paper in 1951 to show you what the binary code is in all of biology. H plus and deuterium. That's it. And this disease you asked me about, this is a sign that the melanin and the sweat glands are getting rid of the biggest heavy metal, deuterium. That's the problem. It turns out when your membranes don't have the proper lipid rafts or the proper lipid configuration, your body then has other plans to try to still help you out navigate the problem. So acanthosis nigricans, you and I both learned that that's usually shows up in people who have diabetes. Diabetes is tied to metabolic syndrome. That tells you that the problem is in the liver. Ironically, you can now understand where we're back to this island of Zuckerland and also the sympathetic chain. You're starting to realize, oh, this is why they get it in their groin. This is the reason they get it in their armpits. This is the problem with the sympathetic chain in the autonomic nervous system. Well, you'll be surprised to know, Eddie, that if you ever have a patient that has acanthosis nigricans on their cervical spine, in their armpits, or on their groin, if they ever get into a car wreck, those people will wind up getting Horner syndrome much easier because their superior cervical ganglion gets popped. Want to hear something else that happens? They have huge problems with sleep after that. Why? Because of the backup pathway that works from the eye that goes all the way to the pineal gland. Most of the functional guys totally shit the bed on this too. They don't realize that pathway goes through the superior cervical nerves, through the superior cervical ganglion into the pineal gland by way of the water networks. That's how you get some melanopsin damage. So when you begin to see this, believe it or not, you can look in those people's RPE on their eye. You'll start to see cholesterol plaques. That's what a drusen is. When you look in their eye, you told me you're a psychiatrist, correct?
Yeah, fairly early on in my career, but yes.
Well, this is what I would tell you to do. If you ever go back and do any free work in the clinic, do me a favor. Please learn how to do a good ophthalmoscopic exam. Every patient with a mental disorder, you're going to notice, almost always has changes in the retina. Here's the cool thing for me to tell you. Every single person that gets a mental disorder diagnosis should have an OCT. Every pediatrician that puts kids even on microdose amounts of melatonin or massive doses, they should have OCTs. Why? You're going to see massive changes in the retina. You're actually going to be pulling their melanin out of their eye because it's not in other parts endogenously in their system. This is the biggest mistake that modern medicine is making today. In fact, I have one of my former members who I had to fire, is actually on the internet being paid, writing things that people should take 1,000 milligrams of melatonin every night. It's totally irresponsible, totally dangerous, but it goes to the point again that someone with a little bit of information can be quite dangerous. I personally feel that way about the functional medicine guys. The functional medicine guys feel that way about me and you. They have no problem, telling people, well, we're idiots for writing statin prescriptions. I actually happen to agree with them about that, but that's irrespective of the point. The point I'm trying to say is that I want people to know that nature doesn't make mistakes. When your armpit has got melanin in it, or you start to notice that you're sweating inappropriately, or you're having an issue with body odor that you normally didn't have, that is a sign something's going on that you need to know about. And if you're not sharing that stuff with your doctor, A, you're never going to get any help. B, you're probably not going to get help anyway because the doctor's not going to have a clue what that means. But, the whole purpose of sweating for humans versus chimps, since they don't have eccrine glands, is not only to get rid of the heavy metal deuterium, but it's also to cool the semiconductors that are embedded in the cholesterol of your skin. Because what did I say in the podcast? Wide band gap semiconductors work better when they're cooled. Okay? That's the key. That's the whole purpose of the cold thermogenesis series that I wrote 15 years ago. And when you do that, you actually create more UV light. So what was the link that I made for most of my members and the people that showed up to the Vermont 2018 talk? I talked to them about how that surface really worked with UV light and deuterium and how we're designed to squeeze the deuterium to make the UV light. This goes back to your question about acanthosis nigricans. I want you to understand how the pieces fit, because the question that you just asked, it's a good one. And I have a duty to you as a colleague to tell you what I know. Why? Because you asked a superb question. And I guarantee you the people that listen to this podcast are going to go, now that's interesting.
Yeah, again, many more rabbit holes come out of that conversation. I think one thing, do you think the deuterium in the sweat would then change how people perceive the smell, and that's where you smell the body odor?
Do you want to know something that's funny? Do you know if you know anything about the sense of smell? I teased Huberman about this off camera. One of his heroes is the guy that won the Nobel Prize for the lock and key mechanism of smell. Obviously, you probably know I don't believe that. I believe Turing is more correct about the electromagnetic and quantum way of doing it through spin. Do you know that Jim El-Khalili has a video that, since he's your countryman, out there about insects, and they took glucose and deuterated it versus non-deuterated? And do you know that the insects always knew where to go? So the answer to you about the question you just asked, absolutely 100%. Now, do I believe that most of your patients and my patients have that ability in them? I do believe that it's in us, but do you know why I don't believe that we see it constantly? Is because people don't realize this. Every single sense that we have, the 5 senses that you learn in medical school, most people don't know that there's melanin between the exterior and the interior of the brain. So in the olfactory nerve and cranial nerve number 1, there's melanosomes. And no one's ever known why the melanosomes are there. Well, now you know the reason why. It turns out if those melanosomes are not active, in other words, there's not melanin around the perikaryon in the neuron, do you think you're going to have this ability that the insects have? The answer is no.
Yeah, well, very, very interesting. I wonder if it's worth just explaining briefly what deuterium is for people. I mean, you've described it on many other podcasts.
Well, it's pretty simple. I mean, just realize that hydrogen is the main source in the sun of red light. Remember that sunlight is 43% red because the atomic spectra of hydrogen. That should be the first key to you. If you remember in the Huberman podcast, I said that blood is a magnetohydrodynamic fluid that wirelessly connects us to the sun. So I just gave you half the part of it. Let's talk about the part that's in us now. Turns out that we have 3 isotopes of hydrogen on Earth. First one is called protium. That's just the proton with the single electron. Second one is deuterium. That's a proton, a neutron with 1 electron. Third one is tritium. Tritium has got 2 neutrons. It's radioactive. We don't have to worry about it, okay? It's not part of this story. So the binary code of life, everything that Eddie learned in biochemistry, I'm going to tell you, can be deciphered from those 2 isotopes. You don't need to know anything else. So this is the dumbed down version that I'm getting ready to give everybody on Wednesday of this week. I've never laid it out the way I'm going to lay it out, but the way to understand deuterium is very simple. You're designed to keep it in your blood. You don't want it anywhere around your mitochondria. In fact, your mitochondria is prejudiced against deuterium, doesn't want any of it around. The water that mitochondria makes at cytochrome C oxidase is deuterium depleted. Why would that be the case? Let's make this really simple, Eddie, for your listeners. Let's go to mass equivalence. If you don't know anything about Einstein, that's fine. You've heard, everybody's heard, even a moron, E equals mc squared. So what did Einstein say? Mass and energy equivalent, okay? So if you have double the atomic mass, how much energy do you think you'll need to move that particle? You need a lot of energy. So why did nature not put deuterium anywhere in our body where there's energy production? Because you would need to use even more energy to move it. That's the short answer. Now there's another answer. Not that I want to go down this rabbit hole, but it also has a different magnetic moment. And the magnetic moment has a lot to do with how our membranes work, has a lot to do with why our notochord and neural plate bent the same certain ways that gave us the brain that we have versus gorillas. And it also has huge impacts in terms of pathways we do and pathways we work. Certain amounts of deuterium in our system actually are able to switch us from the oxidative to the non-oxidative pathway in the pentose phosphate pathway. Most people don't know that. Most people don't know that deuterium turns off glycolysis. This is all true. And it turns out that basically biochemistry inside you is like a Jacquard loom. You know anything about a Jacquard loom? Basically, it's a punch card that goes into a machine that creates this unbelievable amount of silk. You see this beautiful array, and from these little holes on a card, that's how it works. That's actually what biochemistry is all about. And it turns out where the deuterium and the hydrogen is important. You want to hear how incredibly absurd nature is? Because remember, that's not my word. That's Feynman's word. What if I was to tell you from photosynthesis, one part of the carbon backbone, specifically in C3 plants. What is C3? C3, C4, and CAM are the three versions of photosynthesis that basically make food on this planet. You have one hydrogen spot that always is deuterium depleted. And guess what? Everything in the TCA cycle, all those steps that you see in glycolysis that you and I got killed over as first-year medical students, you know what nature's doing? She's looking for the deuterium-depleted hydrogen. That's it. And it turns out everything else is to get rid of the bad deuterium. Turns out we have pathways. You already learned one about sweating. Now you learned another one about melanin. Melanin gets rid of heavy metals. People don't know that, but it's true. You have another big factor in your gut. Now, you ever wonder as a doctor, you ever ask yourself the question, why is it that our brain very rarely turns over in terms of mitosis, but our enterocytes turn over every 24 to 48 hours? Now you know why, don't you, Eddie? Because that's where it's loaded with deuterium, and that's how we get rid of it. Why? What is a fatty liver fundamentally, Eddie? When the circadian mechanism in your eye is broken down, you turn over your gut 24 to 48 hours? No, sometimes you keep those cells a week or two. You think that's good news for the portal circulation? So guess what? Everybody's got metabolic syndrome. You just learned something. Every single one of them gets deuterium in the liver. And guess what that affects, Eddie? It affects the body of Zuckerland. You lose melanin there because what's happening? The melanin is binding. What is it binding, Eddie? The deuterium. And then what does the melanin decide to do once it gets it? It's going back through its embryologic pathway, neuroplastic-wise, because you're no longer able to make endogenous light, and it shows up in your colon. And all of a sudden, when they do an endoscope on you, you've got melanosis coli. And the doctor doesn't have any clue that the melanin's there because it's offloading the heavy metal back into your lumen, so you take a dump. You want to know something, Eddie? In my past career, people that have had melanosis coli, I've asked them to shit in a bucket, bring it to me, and I've actually MRI'd their turd. And guess what we found? Deuterium. Not that hard. Look, that's the whole point that I'm trying to tell you. When you have a framework, all of a sudden you start to ask questions you never would have thought asking as a centralized doctor, right?
So would this explain why the gut uses glutamine rather than glucose for energy, so it doesn't have to put it through glycolysis and waste all of that time or energy?
See, Eddie, you make me happy. You make me really happy. Why? Because we've been talking not even 20 minutes, and you're already smarter than you were when we started. And see, now I hope you can understand why I'm such an asshole to the food gurus, because they don't know what they don't know. And it turns out, if that's something you don't know, is the single most important part of the story. What word did you say that you loved that I used in the U-Room podcast? Incalculable. You understand why I used it now?
Yeah, I think, I mean, going back full circle to kind of where we started with the theme, I fully see your point. He spoke out fairly early in his career and lost his fellowship because he was quite open about statins and their usage and him being fairly against their use.
Right. And the thing is, I can tell you that's the reason why he didn't do what he should have done with the vaccine. I get it. I'm trying to tell you, I get it, because I've lived the same issue he does. There's difference between him and me. I don't care.
Yeah.
I'm going to do the right thing. And the reason I tell you this as a young doctor, learn from my lessons. Don't be afraid of the lesson. Lean into it. Lean into it and say, I understand where Jack's coming from now. I think when people understand this aspect that you're bringing out, I've never had a discussion like this publicly with a doctor. Now, my doctor members, oh yeah, a lot of them know about this. And that's why they're very careful. Like patients out there who are going to hear your podcast, they're going to be like, so the doctors that Jack has interacted with, they basically have to make a decision. Do they want to say publicly really what they believe, or will they be chastised for it? And the interesting part of the story was COVID proves why you had to be really careful. Because if you do tell people the truth, what happened? You got canceled, right? You had medical boards come after you. You had people taking your rights to practice medicine away. You had people ostracizing you on social media. But there's certain people like me who did not give a fuck. Why? We want people to know the truth. And part of the reason I did the Rubin podcast, and if you listen carefully 5 times, which you said, you heard Rick say, I reached out to Jack, and for 6 weeks he didn't respond to me. Why? Because the discussion you and I are having right now is the reason why I didn't reach out to Rick, because I knew if I did, I was putting the target right back on myself. Okay. And that's when my nurse said to me, Jack, this is the time to talk, because COVID has at least woken up half the world that they realize that there is a huge problem. And she goes, if it's not you, who's it going to be? You're the guy that knows all of this stuff. You can explain it like no one else. And that's when Rick said to me, he goes, look, this is so important that I'll be willing to talk about what happened with me with my heart surgery between a decentralized doctor and a centralized doctor. And that was the clincher for me, Eddie. I said, okay, because I think that will wake some people up out there that they begin to understand. People need to understand this from my perspective. If you read Rick Rubin's book, there's a really interesting part of it where he tells the artist in the book, you create not for the audience, you create for yourself. And I have to tell you, Eddie, that's the genesis of why Jack Kruse is who he is. I create for myself, not for the audience. I speak my truth, because if I keep this inside of me, Eddie, it's like keeping deuterium in my body. I have to get rid of it. I have to tell people the truth. And sometimes the truth hurts. Sometimes the truth will make you bleed. 50% of the audience that listens to this, who are low dopamine, they're not going to like this message. But the other 50% that are awake, they're going to go, I'm beginning to understand Jack's perspective now a little bit different. Not only is the perspective interesting, but even when you have big answers for biology, you have to be really careful about how they're disseminated. And, I will tell you that this extends, into art. It extends into Rick's world. Rick is fortunate because in music, it's not a big deal. But I would tell you, I want you to think about Michelangelo, perfect example. He painted the beautiful Sistine Chapel. And what did the Pope do when he came in? Oh, they're all naked. And then they had to pay somebody to come in, paint clothes over Michelangelo's work. Do you realize how crazy that idea is? But I see myself in that story, because that's what I've had to do for 20 years. I've had to paint over all the little details that I'm sharing with you now. The people that have gotten the bigger parts of this message are the people that have paid me to do one-on-one work with them. Why? Because then I don't need to worry about somebody looking over my shoulder and wanting to put me in timeout. Okay? And I don't think people even on the internet, people who are members on my site, realize that the reason the Patreon stuff has to be behind the wall is because some of this stuff, if it was out for public consumption, would put me at risk. This is the secret sauce. This is telling you the reason why Bill Gates wants to block the sun. This is the reason why the government's complicit with it. It's the same reason why we have big tech. Big tech effectively makes you a deuterium collector, turns you into a fruit. I can tell you exactly the reason why autism's happening. I can tell you exactly the reason why kids now want to kill themselves. I can tell you the reason why mental disease has changed tremendously. I can even explain the transgender issue. But you know what, Eddie? Sometimes right now, especially on social media, people are not ready for this truth. My nurse, Rick, thinks otherwise. Jack is I still have my gloves up. I still am concerned about this. And I think we will see how Huberman handles this. We will see how the people that I'm calling out handle this information. The one thing that I'm very comfortable with is I want your listeners, I want the people who are lay public on LinkedIn, Twitter, Facebook, whatever social media platform, Instagram, I want them to know that there's another truth. There's another layer to this onion that they all need to examine for themselves and decide, is Jack Kruse a crazy motherfucker, or maybe does he observe a little bit better than most other people so that he can explain things that they can't explain? That's all I ask. And if you think there's value in that, then you'll spend the $5 a month to read the Patreon. I mean, it's only a cost of a cup of coffee. And if I'm not worth a cost of a cup of coffee, you just told me how you value me. You know, that's how I make the determination, Eddie, whether you're likely going to be the audience that gets it or not. And remember, people think this is a terrible thing. You know, there's going to be people listening to this podcast and say, Jack, you're a doctor. You're supposed to help everybody. I said, this is why I stopped them. I says, does evolution help everybody? Didn't evolution have 5 extinction events? Did everything that was alive make it through? No, see, nature is a pretty harsh little bitch. And guess what? Everything Jack Kruse is doing is exactly the same. I told you a long time ago, even on my forum when you're on there, what does Jack copy? Nature. Nothing I've told you today breaks those dictums. All of my opinions are not based on my theories. They're based on the laws of the universe. E equals MC squared, Noether's theorem, relativity, quantum mechanics, quantum field theory. That's where they all come from. But I'm an observer of nature. I really like to observe because I think when you see everything through the lens of light, water, and magnetism, all of a sudden, some of the paradoxes, the mysteries, the enigmas that you faced in your career and I faced in mine begin to make some sense. And you want to know something? That tickles the clinician, the scientist in me. That's what I like. That's what I like talking about. That's what fires me up. If you think I get fired up talking about carbohydrates, food, fats, and the carnivore diet, no, that's for idiots. That's the truth. That's how I feel.
Yeah. Well, the same. I'm super curious, and for me, COVID was a wake up for me because it made me question the Declaration of Helsinki, where if we don't have any known treatments, then we should be trying as much as we can for these people that are in theory dying from something that we don't have a good solution. And it was just such a letdown as a scientist, as an academic, as a doctor, that we weren't using our basic knowledge of biochemistry, X, Y, Z, to come up with better solutions. And I really can't remember how I came across your work, but I started reading the Patreon blogs in 2020. I think it coincided perfectly with the start of COVID. And I started taking a red light into work and having it while I was on the computer. And I felt like a different person as I read it. And I like the concept that you talked about, is that nature is your randomized controlled trial. And I think an important thing for my medical colleagues to realize, and I sometimes think maybe I need to put this video behind a paywall myself, but my medical colleagues need to think that the control is not present in their randomized control trials. There is no light control.
Here, look, perfect example. See that red? While we're talking, just so everybody can see it, and UV as we talk. So what you just said is the reason I use the word incalculable. Why? Because two things. Remember, every single study that we do is on what? Nocturnal mammals, right? Rats and mice. So we're diurnal. We have different retinas. But then they study them in a lab under blue light. And what did you hear in the Rubin podcast from Huberman's mouth? The number one opsin, the non-visual photoreceptor in mammals, is melanopsin. It's in our brain. It's in our arteries. It's in our fat. It's in our skin. And we're studying these animals in a blue light environment. Then it gets published in a peer-reviewed literature, comes out in England, comes out in the New England Journal of Medicine. And what do? And we don't even think about the methodology in the paper. You, my friend, just hit on why Jack used the word incalculable and why Jack took Eddie Chang's 50% answer and put it at 99.9%.
I think that, that one really, I hope is a, as you say, a punch in the mouth for some people, is that the studies that you're very much putting on a pedestal don't control for the thing that has a significant impact on the brain. You mentioned a while back the impact of mental health disorders on eyes and vice versa. And I've seen that you've started to, I'll use the word approach, Chris Palmer on Twitter. He's written a book called Brain Energy, and I have a copy of it. I looked at the part where he talks about light, and he doesn't mention the habenular nucleus at all in that. And again, it comes back to this question of incalculable. Mm-hmm. So perhaps for the listener, you could discuss this, and I'll also prefix this with as a junior psychiatrist, I have to cover on call in a child psychiatry unit, and this includes overnight. And I've been there several times, and it actually makes me feel physically unwell in that when I turn up there, they're all on iPads at 1 a.m, and all of the people who are doing what they can working there are predominantly from African descent, and they themselves, they're on their phone and they're looking after these kids who are very mentally unwell, who are on their phones in the middle of the night. And I'll leave it there, but I'd like you to riff maybe on the eye mood link.
Well, you probably now know, Eddie, after our first 40-minute discussion, why I went after Chris Palmer, because his book is a joke. Okay. The good idea that he had, because he's right. It is an energy story, but it's also an information story. And Chris Palmer doesn't even seem to know that from the retina through the RPE, through the retinal hypothalamic pathway, that pathway goes directly to the SCN to run the circadian mechanism, but it also doesn't synapse and go straight to the habenular nucleus. What does that control? Controls dopamine and mood. So it should be no mystery why we have this mental disorder issue. You know, same thing is true with obesity. Goes directly to the hypothalamus, to the leptin melanocortin pathway. That's the reason we have obesity. Look, the answers are obvious when you have this perspective. But Chris is a guy that has half the story. Remember how you've always heard me on social media and other podcasts say that if you espouse a half truth, it always leads to a full lie. And that's when Angry Jack comes out and people don't understand why I get so angry. So Eddie, hopefully you begin to understand why I went after Chris Palmer. I did it kind of with kid gloves on, but I did it forcefully with the science, saying this guy doesn't know what he's talking about. And and he's out there with a book, and you're going to read this and think he's right when he's not. And he's never going to be right until he gets the perspective that you and I are talking about. And it turns out the energy production pathway, what you and I both learned in medical school, is we all believe that ATP is the key measure in a cell for energy production. And I would venture to say that 99.9% of the physicians that will listen to this, that you send it to, have that perspective. Most of them don't know the story of Gilbert Ling that I brought up in the Huberman podcast. Gilbert Ling was a brilliant scientist in the 50s who looked at Peter Mitchell's work in chemoosmosis and said, what Peter Mitchell is saying is absolutely impossible because the ATP stoichiometry in a cell breaks the second law of thermodynamics by 500-fold. Not a little bit. Eddie, we're talking about a monster amount. So he basically said and told the world, there's got to be another source of energy in the body. Okay? That's really what he said. If you want to distill Ling down, the other thing that Ling did is he taught the world that technically proteins really are a semiconductor, but they're only a semiconductor when they're hydrated. Why? Because the proteins open up and then water gets into the interstices to do the things that it does. He never got credit for either one of those ideas, but that's what Jack Kruse got out of Ling. What Jack Kruse realized after going through the rabbit hole that I took you through in the Huberman podcast was that melanin was the backup system. What does melanin effectively do besides detoxing metals and do all the other things it does? It actually is dark, really, really dark, and anything that's dark absorbs all frequencies of light. That's number one. But the second thing that it does, it takes water and charge separates it. And if you remember in the Huberman podcast, I told you that I was always fascinated with how does chlorophyll do it? Because the electron volts that needed is 12.06. That puts you in 100 nanometer light. I'm like, 100 nanometer light is soft X-rays. And I know soft X-rays isn't what runs C3, C4, and CAM photosynthesis. There's got to be a way. So when I figured that out, then I started to look at, okay, chlorophyll is a wideband semiconductor. So is hemoglobin. I said, what else is? So if you read the Patreon blogs, you'll see that my hack of the periodic table, what was the key factor that I found? Every single atom that's used in biochemistry is paramagnetic. The other ones are dimagnetic. And I said, this is kind of weird. And I said, paramagnetic means that it's drawn to a magnetic field. I said, mitochondria make a magnetic field. I said, I need to look for a protein in us that is paramagnetic. Guess what I found? Melanin. And this was easy for me. Why? Because I was a neurosurgeon, Eddie. I do MRIs on everybody. And the things that show up on MRI, especially on certain relaxation phases, is blood, acute blood, water, and melanin. It's obvious. We see it all the time. But the thing is, we don't realize it. And when I realized it, I said, oh, this is going to be cool because I'll be able to figure this out. I'll be able to look at MRIs now and understand it. But what I realized is that melanin absorbs all frequencies of light, and then charge separates water into hydrogen, which is used in the mitochondria, oxygen, which is used in the surrounding part of the cell, and then electrons, and the electrons fill up all the semiconductor pathways. So the part of mental illness that you'll appreciate, you know that I show Alexander Wunsch's slide, another MD from Germany, who I think is a brilliant guy. On the first part of the slide, it shows phenylalanine to tyrosine through the hydroxylases. Then it goes to T3, and then it goes to DOPA, and then noradrenaline, dopamine, epinephrine. You know what people don't realize about his slide? That the right hand of the slide is the hypoxia side. The left hand of the slide is when oxygen tensions are high. So when you have melanin, you're creating huge amounts of oxygen tension in a cell. You're never going to be hypoxic. Well, I want you to think about now biochemistry. We now know clearly that when NAD positive drops at cytochrome 1, what does it mean? The cell's hypoxic. What does that mean now to you as a decentralized MD? There's a problem with melanin in the system. It's got to be, because ATP doesn't deal with that. All ATP really does is open and unfold the proteins. Okay, that's it, to allow the water to get in. So it turns out that, by definition, there's a melanin problem because oxygen tensions are low, and that's why NAD drops. So when NAD drops, there's a redox shift that changes the Jacquard punch holes of how hydrogen isotopes are moved. That's the key. And the key with people with mental disorders, as I said in the Huberman podcast, I look at mental disorders as Rick's book. Rick's book is a perfect example of human creativity. It's a bowling alley. There's a gutter here. This is the low dopamine state. That's where depression comes in. That's where Chris Palmer spends most of his time. The other side is schizophrenia, where it's high dopamine but released chaotically. And then everything else in between is creativity. That's Rick's people. And this is the reason why creative people tend to kill themselves. It turns out that when you're hypoxic from melanin, the happy accident for us was the Renaissance. It's Michelangelo. It's all the artwork. And you can walk as a British citizen right now through the museums and actually see how light was painted in the 1100s, the 1200s, the 1300s. You can actually see this happen as we go through the Victorian era. You can see how artists changed it. Who was the first artist that painted with light? Rembrandt. But who were the guys that mastered it? Da Vinci and Michelangelo. And you think about how they lived their life and what was going on at that time. Think about why we really never had a great English painter. Well, the Victorian era probably hindered that with all the clothing that they wore and the fact that, they were so tight about certain things. The French, completely different. They were ready to frolic around naked and this and that. But people don't realize that they think it's a story of culture and society. It's not. It's actually a story of dopamine. And it turns out that when you're in sunlight, because of melanin, you raise oxygen tensions up in your body. That keeps the pathway that Dr. Wunsch put on his slide going from phenylalanine to tyrosine all the way to those amino acids. And not the amino acids, but the neurotransmitters. And I mentioned to Huberman, I said, don't you think it's kind of funny that all the neurotransmitters that are in the frontal lobes of humans are all the ones on the right side of that slide? I said, you get that, right? I said, all the reward tracks, everything we talk about with addiction, I said, they're all there. I said, Rick's people are all the people that are in between those two. I said, that's what Rick's book's about. When I read Rick's book, I'm like, this described the difference between chimps and humans perfectly. But the crazy thing that I've said on the Patreon blogs, and since I know you're reading them now, you probably saw, especially as a psychiatrist, this probably kicked you, that actually human creativity is regressive evolution. And when you read that for the first time, you're like, wow, that is a really different way of looking at it. And I try to make the point to people, think about when we first started finding cave paintings and cavemen. It's when they started to live in caves outside of UV light, right? And wearing skins. And that's when we started putting pictures on the wall. And then when people think that this idea is crazy, I stop them. I say, here's another Brit, UK guy who's brilliant. Sir Michael Crawford wrote a book about human brain evolution. What did he teach us? Neanderthals who went extinct, we still have some of their DNA in us. They had 125 grams more brain tissue. I totally believe that because guess what? I think the last 125 we lost has a lot to do how we became creative. And it turned out through regressive evolution. It means that not every bad thing is bad in evolution. That gave us a survival advantage over the Neanderthals. Why? Because when they kept migrating out of Africa, they got to 44th, 45th latitude. They couldn't live there. But it turned out Homo sapiens, who shrunk some of their brain to make more creativity by living in caves, they were able to survive because they shrunk their brain. And they developed more melanin on their exteriors when they went outside. And when you see this perspective, you go, holy shit. But, when I say this kind of stuff to, say, like Russell Brand or Rick Rubin, because their people are, no one likes to think that they're part of a regressive evolutionary trend. But The reason I mention it to you as a psychiatrist, I feel comfortable saying this to you because I will tell you this is part of the podcast from Huberman and Rick that were cut, and I know why it was cut. So we talked about, transgenderism. Why is it such a big force today? Exactly what I just described to you that happened with the cavemen and cave paintings, that's actually what transgenderism is. It's ongoing regressive changes with hypoxia in the frontal lobes. And what people don't realize, Eddie, when I say this, the science, because I don't want people to say this is a societal or cultural thing for me. The science is pretty clear cut on this. The non-visual photoreceptors in humans all are bound to vitamin A. Okay, when vitamin A is liberated, it destroys photoreception. That's how this process happens. But here's what you probably forgot from medical school, Eddie. You know what vitamin A controls? Sexual selection in hypothalamic neurons in mammals. Shocking, huh?
Yeah, I had no idea about that one.
Of course, but guess what? Remember how you started the podcast. Jack, let's talk about how we're going to change the paradigm. Do you think it's going to happen from within? Because you know what I just shared with you here. You know how explosive that is. I just told you in a 10-hour podcast with those two gentlemen, that hit the editing floor.
Yeah. All this reminds me of a quote by my friend that nothing is good or bad, it just has a function. It makes me...
That's actually a quote in physics too, just so you know that. Information.
Maybe he stole it. Yeah.
Well, it says information is either bad or good. It depends how you use it.
Yeah. It makes me feel accepting of the fact that I'm not particularly creative, which is I can connect dots, but I don't come up with new ideas. So just to summarize, I suppose the fact that ATP doesn't fulfill the full energy requirements of a cell, and melanin is another thing that can provide energy through its ability to disperse light at the cellular level. Mm-hmm. Another one would be DHA, which I think Michael Crawford has written a paper that discusses the evolutionary kind of paradigm around DHA as a quantum material, which I posted before. And actually, I think there's papers that suggest that antidepressants work better in people that have adequate DHA levels.
Do you know why, though?
As an example.
The person that proved why this is the case actually trained me, Nicholas Bazan at LSU. He's an ophthalmology researcher. And one of the things that he discovered very recently in the last 10 years is that when DHA is broken down in the loop of the eye, remember it's called Bazan short loop and long loop, DHA turns into something called alvinoids. Alvinoids are longer chain polyunsaturated fats that actually help with dopamine and melatonin recycle all of the photoreceptors. So when you begin to look at drusen, you begin to look at the changes that you see in the retina, that tells you the reason why these things are out. And the reason why DHA is important for people with mental illness, that's one of the things that's down-regulated. The reason they can't fix the non-visual photoreceptor system in them is because they don't have the substrates to do it. You need UV light to do it, but you also need enough DHA, and people don't realize that DHA is in its highest amount in the retinal hypothalamic tract. But what's the place that you find it in the hemispheres the most? Frontal lobes. This is the reason why people are getting the problem, because the melanopsin problem is tied to this story here. That's where the blue light story is. And that's why when you made the comment about going in to the psych hospital and seeing, the kids and then the people that take care of them all on the computer, you'll remember back to the Huberman podcast when I said one of the things that bothers me about doing brain surgery, modern brain surgery, is that every time I put the microscope down into the brain, I realize just the act of looking in there, because I'm using a xenon bulb on a Zeiss microscope, is actually causing brain damage in my patient. So why do I always put red light and UV light on the surface of the brain before I close? That's the reason why. Most neurosurgeons would hear that and go, this guy's crazy. Or they would wonder why I put hydrogen peroxide in the brain. But there's reasons I do this stuff. There's also reasons my patients do better than their patients. It's because of these things, because I understand how the system functionally works better than they do. I don't understand all of it. I can promise you, when I'm dead, Eddie, there's going to be other people behind me, hopefully that Huberman's teaching, that begin to take the torch. You know, I feel like I took the torch from Becker. I've been running with that torch. Now somebody else needs to pick the torch up. Maybe it's you. Maybe it's somebody that will listen to this podcast who's young and says, you know, this is cool. This is why I went into medicine. I want to learn some of this stuff because it's shocking. If you remember what Huberman said, remember when he was stunned that, yeah, one of these researchers found 20 years ago that we have frog opsins in our brain, and none of us could believe that. And I chuckled about it because I'm like, well, it's clear that none of you PhD researchers know where mammals came from. It makes total sense. They came from fish and amphibians. So it totally makes sense when you understand that. But I didn't even get into that with him at the podcast. The point that I was trying to make is it just goes to show you, when you're in the wrong silo and you don't understand the full breadth of the story, you're apt to make errors. And when you know that melanopsin is the number one opsin in the brain, number one non-visual photoreceptor, and that it actually acts with DHA, and then you realize, okay, DHA is actually in this part of the brain. It's in melanopsins in every artery. You start going, is this the reason why we're seeing more clots now? You know, especially after the vaccine. Is this the reason why we're seeing this, that, and the other thing? The answer is yeah. Like I'm seeing in the wintertime here when I was on trauma call, I was averaging about 13 clots a week. Now that it's May here and the sun is stronger, I'm down to maybe 1 or 2.
Yeah, I think if I'm going to take the torch, I'll have to come over and see how you're practicing clinically at some point and learn all the other golden nuggets. There's something I picked up earlier that I wanted to discuss again in a framework. You mentioned you consider your patients' occupations, and there's something I picked up. I've only seen a few people in my fairly junior years presenting to the emergency department with odd behavior, and they ended up having brain tumors, and they both worked in IT. And I thought, oh, that's an interesting corollary. And then when I came across your work, I thought, well, this somewhat explains that observation. So this question I'm asking you is, how does what you are, a neurosurgeon, but also a quantum clinician, what is your history, examination, investigation, and management? You can give as much or as little as you feel comfortable in terms of maybe cases or just how you think about your interaction with patients.
Well, I think the first thing that you need to do is you need to do a good history. And I don't believe that modern doctors do that. And the reason why is because the electronic medical record is taking that ability away from us. Everything is about putting the stuff in for the bean counters instead of actually sitting down and talking to the patient. So I strongly recommend that doctors go back to the way it used to be, get a scribe to do your EMR, but you sit down and talk to your patient and ask questions. Next thing I do is I always focus on the mother of the patient and then the grandmother. I want to know a little bit about them. That usually stuns people when they come in. And the reason why I'm trying to do that is so I'm trying to assess what their heteroplasmy rate is when they were younger and then what happened. Then I ask about the job, and I'm very detailed about that. I'm asking what kind of car they drive, you know, what they do, how often they wear sunglasses, do they wear contacts. You know, I'm looking for everything on the surface. Then if their wife is there, I'll ask them, you know, does he take his shirt off? Is he embarrassed about his body? And, you know, I get all kinds of weird looks. But then when I collect all the information, then I tell them why. And I said, and then I'll say to them, so I'm going to explain to you, the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to look in your eye. That's always the first place I start when I do my cranial nerve exam. And the reason I start there, Eddie, is for this reason. When I establish that there's a dopamine problem, whether it's high or low, I use the pupil as my perfect metric against my history. So I have a pen light that is white light, then another one that's blue light, and another one that's red light. And I'll use each one of them, and I look at how the pupil reacts. Generally, people that are blue light toxic, people who are low dopamine, they'll respond briskly to the white light. When you use the bluer light, they don't respond as much. Then you put the red light, and they respond tremendously. Why does that work? It tells me that the ciliary muscles that control the pupil, they have a dopamine problem. People forget in medicine that the ciliary muscle, even though it's in your eye, it's still a skeletal muscle. And it turns out that fiber type is controlled by dopamine, dopamine being one of the degradation products of melanin. So this tells me about the melanin status of the RPE of the eye, and it also tells me about the pupillary response. So guess what? I now have information that goes all the way back to the brainstem just by looking at someone's pupil. Then after I do that, the next thing I do is I do an ophthalmoscopic exam, because what am I looking for there? I want to see cataracts. I want to see any problems with the conjunctiva. I want to see any problems with the retina. I'm looking at the vitreous. I'm looking at everything. Glasses, if they have, that'll tell me if they're nearsighted. It tells me about the shape of the globe. What is the shape of the globe in relation to? Dopamine again. So now I'm getting an idea of what the dopamine situation is with that eye. How do I look at the eye versus everybody else? The eye is the on and off switch for the brain. Okay, remember, I'm a brain surgeon. So I want you to understand how I'm thinking. So I'm taking apart the on and off switch. Once I get that, then I know what to look for on the retina. I'm looking, when someone's blue light toxic, around the fovea. That's where the drusen's going to be. That's where the white machine gun effect's going to be. And then if I see AV nicking, the dimensions that I see it in, that actually tells me something about the carotid artery. It tells me about melanopsin in that carotid artery. Because remember, the ophthalmic artery is a branch of the carotid. So now I basically just took that back. What's the next step? You remember from anatomy, my friend, that the sympathetic nervous system follows what artery? The carotid artery in the face. Okay? So now I'm beginning to assess the sympathetic nervous system. What is the major neurotransmitter for that? Nicotine, right? Preganglionic and postganglionic noradrenaline. Noradrenaline comes from what? Degradation product of melanin. That's why I'm paying attention to that. So just their arteries on their retina then tell me about that, okay? From that alone, then I'm examining the rest of their body. Some of the things that we already found out. If somebody's had a colonoscopy, what do? I go back and ask for the data from the gastroenterologist, because, everybody takes pictures now. 99.99% of gastroenterologists never even mention melanosis coli. The only way you can find out is if you go look at the pictures. So give me the pictures. If you've had OCTs, give me the pictures. You had MRIs, you've had CTs, give me everything you've got. Let me look at it. Because your doctors that examine you and made a report, they're not looking for the same things I'm looking for. So it's very detailed. Then after the exam is done, and I take all this demographic data in, sometimes I'll say to my nurse, I want you to go ask, the wife these questions, because I don't think I'm going to get the right answer from the patient. Generally, those questions are about sexual history. Then I'll find that out. And believe it or not, she's sitting here listening to this right now. She'll tell you that we had a patient who, both of them were physicians. The guy didn't want to tell me the truth. The wife told me the truth. And I wound up ordering a calcium index score and found out that he had a widowmaker just from that alone. And see, I knew that there was a melanopsin problem. So the amount of data you can get from doing a good history and physical is good. I find, my opinion is that EMRs block us from that. So I don't use electronic medical record. In fact, I hate computers in medicine. I think they're the things that have dumbed doctors down the most. Why? Because they're blue screens, they're affecting their melanopsin levels and lowering their dopamine. So I think they lose a lot of this discriminating power that they have. And ultimately, what are people paying us for, Eddie? They're renting our brain for that period of time to find where they're broken down. So I believe that you need to spend more time. I'm a big believer in touching, feeling, and doing things with the patient. Absolutely. There's things on their body. I want to know every different part of their body, where they're pale, where they're not. because these have implications. I want to know if in the past they got gout, where they got gout, because that tells me where the melanin problem is. What joint was it in? If they had surgery, when they had their appendix out, what time, what they were doing. In other words, I want to know what the environment was like when they had these specific surgeries. Why? Because there's always more clues to the story there than what a normal history and physical will give you. That's the reason why me reviewing one of Eddie's physicals is probably not beneficial. I need to still sit down with the patient and ask more questions. Why? Because I may find something that you didn't think was consequential, but is. Why? Because the way I look at things is different than the way you do, which is another reason why what I said to Huberman, this is important. I hope every doctor that listens to this understands this, that we need to fundamentally go back to what makes us physicians and makes us good. It's our power of observation. And I think technology dumbs us down in terms of doing that. So when I get all that done, if I missed anything, Eddie, you know what my fallback is? What makes me a better doctor? My MRI. My MRI tells me where the redox problems is. Why? What does an MRI do? Shoots RF radiation at every protein on our body, screws up the precession. I get T1, T2 relaxing images. Then I'll get, diffuse tensor images. And guess what that tells me? It tells me the state of the hydrogen proton everywhere in their body. What did I tell you earlier that I'm paying attention to? Hydrogen and deuterium, right? So anytime I see a deuterium shadow anywhere, what does that tell me, Eddie? I got a melanin problem there. What else do I look for? In the muscles of the body cavity, if there's fat replacement, that also tells me there's a problem with melanin in that somite that goes all the way back to the neural crest. There is so much data on an MRI that a radiologist missed that if you are a doctor and don't read your own films, in my opinion, you're committing malpractice. How's that?
I just to touch on that, I guess visceral fat then is a risk because it's the deuterium being extruded from the organ itself. And that's why we see it as, yeah.
And it's trying to offload it to melanin. The reason why you lose the melanin inside your body is because your system is overloaded with this heavy metal. And it's, the problem is nobody considers deuterium a heavy metal, but remember, this is the theory of relativity. Is it a heavy metal compared to hydrogen? It's double the atomic mass. The body wants to get rid of it. There's nothing about a mitochondria that likes deuterium. And once you have this perspective, you go, holy shit, this is a big deal. Like when you start to see this, you start to look at, like, I'll give you an example. Yesterday, like a come to Jesus moment that happened with my nurse. I'll go out in the sun and I'll get peeling skin. And she always likes to peel the skin off me. I'm like, can you stop? And she's like, you look terrible. I'm like, it doesn't matter. That's where the deuterium is. My body is getting rid of it. Leave me alone. If you want to know how I detox trauma call, that's how I do it. And, I've had people on the internet ask me all the time, and I never ask the question. It always happens this time of the year. So that's what reason I'm mentioning it, because you're asking me about clinical pearls that I want you to pay attention to. Anybody who's from the UK, because, everybody in the UK is pale as all hell. You put them out in Hyde Park and they get red that first time. And then the first 3 or 4 weeks after, they keep getting red before they build up their solar callus. They'll notice they get these little white spots all over their skin. And everybody thinks, oh, what's that? That's actually the LDL cholesterol and filled with deuterium in your body getting out. Okay? You want to get rid of that. You slough it off. Because what are you doing? You're changing the cholesterol in your body to HDL format. Because HDL has more electrons. How does this work? Photoelectric effect. If you have more electrons, you absorb more light. See, the reason why you can't absorb light, the reason why people in the UK stay white so long, so you don't have a lot of melanin in your skin. Remember, Eddie, I'm not saying anything that's unusual because my people come from the 59th latitude. So me and you have something in common here.
Yeah, I'm Fitzpatrick type 1 as well, I think.
There you go. So the thing is, I can now stay out in the sun for 8, 9, 10 hours a day and not have a problem because I built my solar callus up. Most people who are doctors who listen to this in the UK, I get red and white. Well, there's a reason you do, because you're not out in the sun enough, because you haven't changed the membranes in your body that all mammals have this program for. And when you do this, your body is designed to get rid of the bad mojo. The thing is, you just have to get out of the way. The problem is, putting you know, a tyrosine inhibitor like sunscreen on your skin, or, you know, wearing sunglasses, that's not the way to do it. Do it like a lion does. Go in the shade, you know, if you get too much. That's the smart move. But your body will get rid of it. It needs the solar stimulus to make the change physiologically in you so that you get the story right. People don't realize that when cholesterol has more electrons in it and it changes, that means all the proteins embedded in it also change. Like, people are shocked to find out that insulin doesn't work in cold. So when I tell people with the ACTH story from POMC, as ACTH goes up, blood glucose up, and CLIP raises insulin, everybody's like, oh, well, that's definitely the problem. They don't realize insulin's not a problem when you're in cold. It doesn't get into a cell. So insulin isn't a problem. Why? Because the membranes change. The problem is insulin's a problem when it can get in. So this whole thing about you understanding how you're built to work in nature is really important, because that lipid raft that's in your membranes pays attention to the solar stimulus you're giving it. So if you're a guy from the UK and you're constantly, you know, wearing clothes and working at night, like Boy George or George Michael, it's makes no sense why they have the issues they have, because you begin to see they're running the wrong program at the wrong time of the year, and they're not using the appropriate stimulus. So it should make no perfect sense why their biochemistry doesn't marry up. And the answer isn't when they go to the NHS to give them a statin. It's actually the wrong answer. And that's the reason why, like, Malhotra was right to say what he did. And it's the reason why Peter Attia is wrong to tell people to take statins and live longer so he can write a book and become a millionaire doing it. I mean, it's just irresponsible medicine. And the thing is, I'm not here to police the Peter Attias or the Aseem Malhotras of the world. I'm here to police their patients, the public. I want the public to know what those doctors don't know. And hopefully when they get outed, they learn what I've learned. Because remember, I made the same mistakes that those doctors made. Look, I was a dumbass too, you know, for the first 40 years of my life. And trust me, if you don't think that it had a big effect on me, to realize, you heard what I said in the Huberman podcast, that those 18 months when I realized that I hurt more people than I helped, that was devastating to me. But that's also the reason why now I'm an asshole. I'm a total asshole. Why? Because I believe that oath that I took, I meant it when I took it. I really meant it. When I realized that I was taught a lot of things in medical school that were antithetical to the health of my patients, that made me madder than hell. And that madness, that passion, is what you see in me every single day on social media and what you see in me in podcasts.
Yeah, I think people always get surprised the last few years that they see, or how did you get tanned? Because you never used to tan, you used to get burnt. And I'm proud of something I worked on over the last few years. I was overconfident. My usual co-host Richard, he did a retreat in Mexico a couple of months ago, and I went with my usual confident self, but I was in winter mode, and the Mexican sun was more than I was ready for, and I didn't get a strong sense of I need shade. So it was a lesson in still respect the sun. It can be a powerful thing.
Absolutely. It's one of those things that I like to explain to people. When you go from the UK to Mexico, remember, most of the cholesterol is in the LDL format, non-electron. So the reason you can't make vitamin D is, remember, vitamin D gets created from cholesterol through a process when you're in the sun. It gets sulfated. That gets transmitted through the bloodstream to the liver and the kidney to be changed. But this is the key point. The reason why so many people from the UK can go to the sun, stay out, and never raise their vitamin D up is because they don't realize that their cholesterol on their surface doesn't allow the process to happen. There's a photoisomerization step that has to happen to make vitamin D dihydroxy to go be changed to vitamin D3 in the kidney and the liver. And the thing is, if you're cholesterol on the surface hasn't been changed, you're not going to make it.
Yeah.
And that's the reason why the solar callus blog exists, because effectively, what are you doing? You're actually changing the electrical insulator abilities, and the semiconductors that are in your skin, which is what melanin is. They work best once the skin has got the perfect lipid, rafts that are floating in it. And that process takes time to happen. Doesn't take a lot of time. That's the beautiful thing about mammals. They adapt really quickly, but we're the only mammal that can get on a Virgin flight and go from London to the 20th latitude in 6 hours and think, hey, I'm ready to go. And that's kind of the gist of the story. I want, the doctors that are in the UK to realize why that's happening. If you would have photo adapted in the UK before you came, use the solar callus blog, use the red light, understand really what you're doing, you would have been like, okay, I got it. Now it makes some sense.
Well, I guess then as some applicable advice maybe for people is if they need to start getting some more sun and renovating their melanin, as you say, maybe putting the holiday towards the end of the summer when they photo adapted. I guess this is the reason why as well, evolutionarily, we would have gained weight towards the end of the summer so we can absorb and maintain more vitamin D in the system as a fat soluble hormone, and then it can last through that winter period and keep us going. Think
about what you just said though, Eddie. I want to correct you on one thing.
Yep, sure.
Remember, when vitamin D is sulfated, anything that's sulfated is more water soluble. So that's how it gets from the skin to the liver and kidney. You're correct that vitamin D itself outside the body is fat soluble, but the big mistake people make is for it to operate in us, it has to be made more water soluble to go from the blood to the kidney and liver to be changed. And that's a really important point. It's the same issue with cholesterol sulfate. Like, people don't realize when you take vitamin D pills, what you're effectively doing, because that's a fat lipid, to get it to where it needs to go, you have to create cholesterol in you, LDL cholesterol, to bring it to those organs. When you get it by sunlight, you don't create any LDL cholesterol to bring it through because it's sulfated and it gets there. And that's the reason why when you'll see some people in the UK get put on like 15, 20,000 units of vitamin D, you're actually raising their cholesterol. And then what will the doctor do? Put you on a statin. You don't want to do that. See, it's so clear that, the left hand and the right hand in centralized medicine don't really understand how the system really works. And this is the reason why you always hear me rail against people that advocate for vitamin D supplementation. I'm like, no, that's not the way to do it. You want to do it the natural way, and realize in the mammalian system, once you make it the right way, we have a vitamin D binding protein that is what gets you through the winter. So your answer that you said, taking the trip at the end of August or September, if you're in the UK, is smart. Then I think coming up with a plan like these two lights that I showed you earlier, or learning how to build your solar callus and keep it going, or maybe taking a trip, to the Azores or to the Canary Islands, say in December, January, to help your system. But realize that will help short term, but it's not going to completely electrically change the cholesterol in your system, because as soon as you go back home, and you heard Rick say this, Rick said, it's so funny, when I leave Costa Rica, come back to LA, I can feel the tan leaving my skin right away. There is a reason for that. That's how fast the electric changes happen in cholesterol as a non-visual photoreceptor. And again, when you don't understand how the system works, when Rick says something like that to a physician, it sounds crazy, but you heard what I said in the podcast. I'm like, no, you're not crazy. That makes total sense to me, but it also shows you how plastic melanosomes really are when cholesterol changes.
So do you think melanosomes can be passed between cells?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Well, if deuterium can, why can't melanosomes?
Yeah.
Remember what I said to you before, Eddie, that melanosomes effectively are heavy metal toxic picker-uppers. So, like, what's their superpower? Their superpower is that they collect all the heavy metals in our body, but they also collect all frequencies of light. And I'm talking about from radio waves all the way up to gamma rays. So they're one of our protection issues in there. And what do? We turn that back into physiologic work. Now, you can imagine that melanin has to be renovated because it has these superpowers embedded in it. That's why I gave you the story before about the pigeons. I guarantee you when you're in London now and you see those pigeons, you're not going to shoo them away. You're going to look at them and say, this is an unbelievable adaptation that goes all the way back 65 million years ago. And you're going to see that adaptation in those dark pigeons and you have allowed your clade to exist at the 52nd latitude like they have because of melanin. And when you see that story, it's just stunning. It's just stunning to see nature finds a way. And the thing is, it's our job as clinicians, to put that story that happened to you while you're drinking a glass of wine, having charcuterie on the street in London, and taking that back to your psych patient, saying, you know what? I know why you got this problem in your frontal lobe. Let's take the iPad away and get you out to Hyde Park. Let's get you in the sun. Let's start teaching you how to sphinx. Let's start putting you in red light. Like, for example, the hospital, the NHS should have red lights in just about all the areas that you guys do, I don't know what you want to call it, talk therapy or psychotherapy. I'm a really bad person to talk about that because I remember when I did my psych rotation as medical student, I was a train wreck. I thought psychiatry, what they were doing was the craziest thing in the world. I said, this is never going to help these people get better. And back then, I didn't know any of the things I know now. Now I'm like doubling and tripling down why they never got better, because we always did these talk therapy things, Eddie, in a room with fluorescent light. Never made any sense at all.
Well, that's the reason I actually chose psychiatry out of all of the specialties is at least it was the one specialty where you do get to have a long sit down with the patient and have a conversation more than an hour, and as you say, without a laptop or whatever is better than not.
Right. You remember, I'm older than you, so I remember the days where nobody in the clinic would run me off from spending a half an hour or 40 minutes with a patient. But, I can tell you the beginning of my medical career, when somebody came in to see me with a cervical disc or a brain tumor, it would take me 30 or 40 minutes to get through everything with them. You're right. Today in centralized medicine, if you're not done with them in 5 or 10 minutes and all your stuff's not input, you're going to have some clinic manager from the hospital come and tell you, you're too slow. We need you to see 40 more patients. You can't do it this way.
Yeah. You use the word evolution, and I'd mentioned before that I've studied with Dr. Jack Kruse, who I think you guys know each other. And he's a great guy. And he started to frame our teaching under this evolutionary framework, more specifically the cell danger response. I don't know if you've read the paper by Robert Navio, but it's very good at outlining the biochemical pathways, but it frames it as a summer and a winter metabolism, but at no point in the whole paper, I don't think he mentions UV and cold and that piece of the puzzle.
Yeah, and that's the whole thing. If you remember reading back my original CT series, I talk about the thermoplastic biology of mammals, that there's cold adapted and warm adapted. Basically, what was that an acronym for? Deuterium and hydrogen. That's actually what changes the morphology. And that's why I mentioned in Sarah Pugh's podcast, Rick's podcast, people need to go back and read the most brilliant Englishman, as far as I'm concerned, of the 20th century was Alan Turing. And that paper that he wrote on morphogenesis, dude, that should be a required reading for every single doctor in the UK, because that explains the changes in biochemistry, explains the changes on our surfaces.
It's one of my favorite films is The Imitation Game. I don't know if you've seen it, but yeah, it's a travesty what happened to him. He probably had a lot more lessons to teach, I think.
Well, Eddie, don't you think it's the same story, though, that happened with him that happened with Semmelweis?
So I don't really know the story of Semmelweis very well.
Well, this one's pretty simple. Back when Semmelweis, like, you went to medical school, so you remember, you wear rubber gloves, right, when you go and do surgery, right?
Yes.
Okay, so where did that idea come from? It came from Semmelweis. Back in the day, they used to have midwives and doctors. And what they noticed is that if you got taken care of by a doctor, the baby and the mother died of childbirth fever. But if you had a midwife, you didn't die. And how was this really easy to figure out back in the day? The doctors came to deliver babies at the nighttime. So midnight all the way until shift change in the morning. If you came in there, you would die. So the women would have the baby hanging out of their vagina half the night, waiting for the midwives to come. So this guy Semmelweis, who was a doctor, said there's got to be a reason for this. So he looked into it and he found out that the habit of the doctors was to go to the anatomy lab, not wearing gloves, to work on dead bodies. And then they would come and deliver babies. So he said, well, this should be simple to fix. All we need to do is put chloroform on our hands and then put rubber gloves on. So he brought that to the doctors, made the change, and nobody died. The problem was the doctors realized that Semmelweis solution, they were the cause of the deaths, and they didn't like that. So what did they do? They convinced him to go do a rotation at a mental institution. When he was there, they beat him up, then drugged him and said that he was mentally ill, and he died in the mental institution. That's how centralized medicine works with guys that are really far out in front of them. So there's a lesson there. That's what they did to Semmelweis. You know what they did to Turing. What did they do to Becker? You see what I'm saying? This story repeats. There's a fractal there, and that's part of the reason I was very, very concerned about going to talk to Rick and Huberman. It's part of the reason why some of the things I've shared with you today. It's why I don't like talking about this stuff.
Yeah, the paywall is sounding more appealing. It's I mean, I study, as I said, I studied biochemistry before medicine, and even reflecting back, what the first lab we ever did was measuring the concentration of proteins using the Beer-Lambert law with the absorbance spectra at 280 nanometers. And I only just remembered that this week preparing to chat to you. And then I spent a year studying mTOR back when David Sabatini was well-revered and kind of at the peak. And I wanted to go and meet him. I never ended up doing that. But I met Michael Hall, who discovered mTOR in yeast. And I don't want to dwell too much on mTOR. It's one of these kind of Maxwell demons that controls the summer and the winter metabolism switch based on UV light.
Yeah, it's all about 380 nanometer light, my friend.
The structure of rapamycin is interesting. Do you think that's a light story as well?
Absolutely.
No
question about it. I mean, the reason that this story is important, remember that one of the proteges of Sabatini is Peter Attia. And Peter Attia right now talks a lot about mTOR. And since he's the guy that's got a lot of people's ear, him and Sinclair, why am I so interested in these guys? Because I don't want them making the same mistake that everybody else has made about mTOR. And it's amazing to me, Sabatini, he discovered a lot of things, but he never could explain why things upstream the system were not working. And it's pretty obvious when you understand the non-visual photoreceptor system and how 380 nanometer light works. What people haven't done, this is the defect in researchers. If you look at UV spectrum, you'll notice that the spectrum in the UV that creates the most ROS and RNS goes about 40 nanometers right before 380. And you know what happens? 380, there's a sharp cutoff. So from 380 to 400, that's the part of the UVA spectrum that is engaged in photo repair. So remember we talked about Becker earlier, and I told you Becker was about mammalian ability to regenerate. That's the frequency of light that created his DC electric current, that he was able to regrow fingertips and things like that, when he tried to recapitulate what he found in salamanders. And it turns out that it's no shock that neuropsin is on our cornea and our skin, because that is the non-visual photoreceptor that is critical in regeneration and repair and wound healing. And that's completely broken, in diseases like diabetes. And it goes back to what we said earlier, is that when that vitamin A is liberated, it destroys photoreceptors. And what do you need to fix photoreceptors? You need dopamine, melatonin, and the breakdown products of DHA, which are the alvanoids. You know, and I talked to Dr. Bazan this past week. His lab just found two more of these chemicals, now 43 and 46 double bonded carbons. So turns out there's even more alvanoids than what we thought. And I said to him, and I said it to him in passing because it was a quick phone call. I said, I guarantee that those alvanoids are going to be found down the road to regenerate the opsins. Like, I think the ones that he found in the eye that are the 34, 36, and 38 double bonded carbons are the ones that fix the melanin and the ones that fix rods and cones. But I think the other ones are the non-visual repair mechanism. But the afferent part of the signal, I think, is 380. And that's what mTOR works on. And when you understand mTOR from that light switch moment, all of a sudden, many of the things that Sabatini has found, that Adia talks about, begin to make some sense. You know, and I know the guy that you're working with, Ted is a big biochemistry guy. He's a big mitochondria guy. I've always told Ted that he's way too focused on the biochemistry. That's not the story. The story is how light controls the boxcars in biochemistry. That's the real prize. And it's a shame all the things that have gone on with Sabatini, but if he can ever fix his reputation, the thing he needs to do is go back in the lab and start working with light and mTOR, and I think he'll actually earn his Nobel Prize then. Because to be honest with you, all the other shit that's gone on with him, I could care less about that. I care more about his ideas than, you know, how he chooses to live his life.
Yeah, I agree. I think if you're a scientist, that's the important side of the coin, so to speak. I had something really great pop up in my head during you speaking, and now it's gone, unfortunately. But it's always the way. Maybe it'll pop up again later. How, more of an applicable thing, how do you begin with somebody? It's a fairly common thing, or more common thing, this long COVID or chronic fatigue syndrome. Somebody who can't get out of bed to go see the sunrise.
Well, you saw the two versions of light that I showed shining on myself.
Mm-hmm.
600 to 1,000 nanometer light, 380 to 400. So you begin photo repair right there. What does the red do? It increases ATP in their body. What does the purple light do? Purple light begins to change the lipid grafts and the exterior. The whole real big issue with people that have chronic fatigue is they have the wrong coat and they no longer have any melanin in that coat. What people don't understand is the reason why people who have chronic fatigue have pain is because they have no melanin and no red light in the system. So it turns out, if you read the photobiomodulation literature about Tina Carew and Hamlin, you'll notice a big trend that everybody who uses red light notices that pain improves tremendously. The other thing that they haven't put together, when you put UVA light with infrared A light, that's the best way to improve pain. Why? Because nobody has read the literature on POMC. It turns out that beta endorphin story is huge, and it's broken in people with chronic fatigue syndrome. So UV light causes translation of the chemicals that are cleaved from POMC. So if you add both of those lights back, in other words, if they're, say, in a hospital or in their house, put that on or break the window. Actually break the window and let the sun come in. And if it's cold, even better, because remember what cold does. It actually stimulates them to make more UV light on the inside. That's absolutely what they need. They will complain vehemently that they have pain from the cold. But you need to know as the clinician that you must persist. Why? Because what are you doing? It's the same story, Eddie, that I gave you before about the people from the UK that go to Mexico in one day. They have to photo adapt. Now, people who have chronic fatigue syndrome take longer to photo adapt because for decades they have been in the wrong light. And it's broken everything on their surface system. But trust me, with enough time doing that, that's the beautiful thing about mammals. They can regenerate.
Yeah, I think it's worthwhile touching. I mean, you've talked on POMC a few times. This is the pro hormone, I guess we can call it.
Yeah, pro-opiomelanocortin. You need to know that's the hormone that really mammals specialize in and thrive with. It cleaves to 7 different proteins. All the proteins have different effects. No one in medicine really understands why they're on the same gene, why they do certain things. But the story that I've laid out for you in the last hour and a half, every single thing that I've said ties back to that gene at some level. Now, it's your job to figure out that recipe, but I think if you listen to my podcast and you listen to my Patreon blog and you hear all the things I talk, all of a sudden you start going, now I'm beginning to see how this whole pathway works, to see how all these options work together, how there's certain frequencies of light that really work, and they work with POMC. And once you learn how to turn this gene on and get it to do its job in the right season, you can have a massive impact on people. And it's that simple. It's not really that hard to do. I think it's probably a bigger deal for the patient and the doctor when you're doing it. Like if you've got somebody with chronic fatigue and I tell you, break the window, let the sun in, let it cold, on the surface, that sounds so crazy to the family and the doctor. But actually, when you understand the mechanism of what you're doing, you go, wow, that makes a lot of sense. And you don't allow the patient to do what they've done. They've sat in front of the television and the computer for 20, 25 years, living an indoor life. They've got absolutely the wrong exterior coat. And what happens when the exterior coat's bad? Everything on the inside starts to fall apart. That's effectively what that disease is. And you know, Eddie, that in our profession, there's a lot of doctors out there that will tell you, I don't believe that fibromyalgia or chronic fatigue syndrome is even a disease. And, you know, I like when they say that. Why? Because it outs them as an ignorant asshole. Because it's obvious that it's a disease, but it's a disease that they don't learn about. So therefore, they just magically think if we don't think about it, I don't have to worry about it. But yet, every year we go further with the use of technology that's brought us indoors outside of the sun. This disease continues to grow, and all the diseases associated with it, like mental illness, are growing exponentially. But yet nobody can figure out why. Well, I think when you listen to Uncle Jack long enough, you go, holy shit, I get it.
In the research institute I work at, there's somebody who focuses on chronic fatigue, hypermobility syndromes, POTS, and all those related things. And they make so much sense when you think about the cleavage products of POMC. They control insulin, they control glucose, they control stress. They, as you say, they control the color of your skin, and they control the arms of the immune system, and one of them being autoimmune.
Feeding. Don't forget, controls feeding.
Feeding.
Yeah, feeding, it has to be tied to the seasons. Just think from a mammalian perspective. That's what the leptin melanocortin pathway. That's why most people who have chronic fatigue are also obese. That's why they're linked. This is all a POMC story.
Yeah, very interesting.
See, I love when doctors say that, because you know that you just set off their wideband semiconductors in their own head, and they're like, I didn't think about it like that. Now and see, that's why I said this is incalculable, because you begin to realize, oh my God, there's like so many more things can be explained by this. And you have to realize, Eddie, I've been living in my skin with this knowledge in my head for 20 years. Can you imagine how frustrating it is? Well, talk to other doctors and they think that I'm crazy when they're the ones that are crazy. How could you not know this?
Yeah, I mean, I've been sitting in talks since, I guess, 2011, 2012, thinking, but we're missing part of the story. And I never really knew the whole story, but we were always missing part of the story. And even recently, I sat through 10 different labs giving their overview of what they're studying. And I could link back each of their pieces of work to POMC. And I thought, well, you've all been applying for grants of millions of worth of amounts of money. What if the one grant just studied this one thing, and we would have exponentially more data to explain more things much quicker, but
this is the reason why I told Huberman that the published literature is garbage. Why? We're creating a pile of garbage and we're making it harder for doctors to go find the needle in the haystack.
Well, I do wonder if when AI comes around and it looks through the literature, it will just point it out and say, why weren't you looking here?
No, it won't. And the reason why is because guess who put the data in? We did.
Well, yeah.
And guess who's making the AI? Google and Big Pharma. They're going to make sure. I'm going to tell you that what I'm talking about now is going to be buried further under AI. Why? That affects their business model.
I'm sure you must. Have you heard of Michael Levin and his work?
Absolutely.
Yeah, I think. Do you think he has the story of the DC electric current and is going to change some of the paradigms there?
We'll see. We will see. Let's put it this way. I talked about this in a podcast yesterday with a group from Silicon Valley, and I took it all the way back to the DC and AC power wars. I said, I have more affection for Edison, even though he was a poor human being, than Tesla, because Tesla is the reason why most of the problems that you and I have talked about for the first 2 hours here exist. And people don't realize just when they plug in a light to an AC power grid, you're modulating the frequency. Do you know that if you had a trimeter, you're emitting RF radiation and microwave just by plugging into the AC power grid? When I tell people that, they're kind of stunned. I said, that's part of the reason why we all have problems. And I said, remember, when you do that, melanin in your system can help offset that risk. But what happens when you don't have any melanin anymore? What happens when you live 24/7 like that? Well, guess what? That story's been going on since the World's Fair in Chicago since 1893. So if you want to know why Alzheimer's showed up in the literature in 1911, why autism showed up in 1940, why now we have the stuff we just talked about, transgenderism in the 2000s. I want you to think about what we've done with technology. As we ramped it up, human disease, Neolithic human disease has gone up. And the problem is no one wants to blame it on technology. Why? Because all of our economies are based on it. Plus, we're all addicted to it. I mean, just think about it now. Me and you wouldn't be talking right now if it wasn't for this use over. But here's the beautiful thing about mammals, especially smart mammals. You can learn how to use technology wisely. Like after I talk to you, I'm going out in the sun to offset, some of the damage that I'm getting from this.
Yeah.
And the thing is, I want people to know that. Yeah, I'm not anti-technology. I'm telling you that you have to be able to understand how it affects your biology. And that's really the failure of both centralized medicine, big tech, big food. And I believe it's more nefarious than you want to know. I think big tech knows all this stuff, and they're actively doing it because it addicts us, just like we're addicted when we go in a casino to playing a slot machine. That's why there's no windows in there. That's why everything's blue lit. And all this data came from, the CIA and DARPA. It's not an imagination that this stuff's out there. A lot of times when you talk about this stuff, people say this is conspiratorial, but it's not. The CIA, we know, had MK Ultra. MK Ultra went underground and became a big focus in the Tulane neurosurgery and neurology departments, and also then came under the PhD work of Carlos Delgado. And since then, it's gone underground, but it's popped back up. If you go look at the patents around screen technology, somebody's got to ask the question, why is it that every screen that's made on a tech screen is always blue lit? And it's always in the blue light hazard between 435 and 465. I'm going to tell you the reason why. Because it lowers your dopamine level, which means you degrade your melanin panels. They know it. Why does Bill Gates want to block the sun? Why does Bill Gates want to buy land all over the United States and then put wax that's loaded with deuterium on organic fruit? I know exactly why he wants to do it. Why is he in the vaccine game? He's not a doctor. All you have to do, Eddie, you want to do a shocking biohack? I told the guys yesterday this. When COVID started and we had the vaccine, I took 3 vials that were partially spent, put it in an MRI bowl, and MRI'd it. Guess what it looked like? Deuterium signal. Shocking. And you can test this yourself. You work in the NHS. If you want to prove this to yourself, take an egg, or even better, if you get an ostrich egg, take an ostrich egg and do an MRI of it. You'll find out the yolk is completely deuterium depleted. The white part's around. What do most people in the UK do? Oh, give me an egg white omelet. Throw the yolks away, when they should be doing exactly the opposite thing. The other big thing, I mean, let's hit all the sacred cows out. The carnivore and paleo guys, are all about, seed oils and talking about that. None of those idiots seem to know that linoleic acid is basically a deuterium story. They want to keep talking about, why eating meat is better. Well, there is a reason that Bill Gates wants everybody to eat bugs and fruits, because that's where he's putting the deuterium in. But what you don't realize is that animal products are deuterium depleted. But the thing is, how do you ruin animals? Well, make sure you feed them C4 grasses, which is what they do, so their tissues are loaded with deuterium. See, the key part of the story is if you keep in front of a computer screen and keep them out of the sun, and you got the dermatologists and ophthalmologists keeping people out of the sun, you understand how you create 7 billion idiots on the planet? That's what you're doing. That's what we're doing. If you want to know the reason why, what's going on right now in the EU, in Amsterdam, the Dutch people, you have a leader on the stage, pushed up by Klaus Schwab, telling people we want to make farming illegal. Do you know why? They want control of the food. Now you're beginning to understand why. But see, when I say this, without the context that I gave you the first 2 hours, everybody says that Uncle Jack is engaging in conspiratorial issues. No, I'm not. I understand the science better than fucking you do. I know exactly what they're doing. I know, I've looked at their patents, and I know they know it. I just call them out. But guess what? I warned Huberman. I said, dude, when you go down this rabbit hole, be ready. Be ready, because it may turn out some of the people that support your lab will stop supporting your lab. That's exactly what happened to Dr. Becker when he went on 60 Minutes in 1977 and told people the truth about power lines that went from Niagara Falls to New York City. That was, remember, back in those days, there was no really a ton of non-native EMF. But he was very, very wise, wiser than you want to know. Just the reason I revere him, Doug Wallace and Gilbert Ling, is they told the public a truth and held to the end. That's why Uncle Jack's an asshole too. I'm learning from them that if you break the rules and, a doctor, and you try to be a quantum clinician, but you're still selling supplements and detox programs to people, you're a fucking idiot. And you're a fucking liar. And you should be called out. And the gloves need to come off, because you're no different than the guys writing prescriptions for statins or fluoroquinolones and floxing people. You're doing exactly the same thing. And even if you are ignorant that you're doing it, ignorance is not a defense. Because remember, you're the expert that should know better. You took an oath to do no harm. So I'm that guy that's going to hold your foot to the fire. And I'm okay if you don't like me. See, that's the difference between probably me, Becker, Ling. I don't give a flying rat's ass. I know I'm right. Because if I'm wrong, so's Einstein. So's the photoelectric effect. So is Norther Stearman. So is Richard Feynman. I think I got pretty good company. That's what makes me so cocky. And I've told people it's not cocky if you can back it up. And why do I do this? Not to show you that I'm smarter than everybody else. It's to let you know how much they've missed, so that you know, and that you can go see your doctor and then go do what you need to do. When the sun is out in Hyde Park, you take an early lunch and you get in that sun, even if it's for 20 minutes. When somebody hands you a group of supplements from, Dave Asprey, you say thanks and you throw it out. You know better. See, when you know better, you do better. And you have to realize that there's a famous guy, I don't know where he's from, Upton St. Clair. It says, when a man's salary depends on the truth, usually who's paying you, determines the outcome. Charlie Munger also said, incentives determine outcomes. I totally agree with that. So the public needs to know what the incentives are for people just about every level. So what's the incentive for me, Eddie? Let's cut to the chase. Jack doesn't sell you that stuff. You know what you pay Jack for? You pay Jack to rent my brain for a short period of time. If you want to be a patient, you're paying me a pretty penny to rent my brain. Why? Because one-on-one time with me is worth a lot. If you don't think I'm worth a lot, you're not going to pay it. And Uncle Jack's okay with that. Now, I'm not everybody's cup of tea. I just want to make sure that I wake you up. I want you to know there's a lot to this story out there. And it is quite correct to say that you can fix a lot of your own problems with my information. You don't need a lot of fancy stuff. But before people are ready to do what they need to do, Eddie, they have to get out of their own frontal lobe's way. And the problem is when you're addicted to the thing making you sick, that's easier said than done. And you know, as a psychiatrist, that what I just said, that's a truth bomb. It's really difficult to fix a heroin addict. It's really difficult to fix somebody with bipolar disorder when they stop, or you tell them you can't play electric guitar at night in front of 100,000 people, or you have vitiligo and you have to take Diprovan to go to sleep. Those people are addicted to their lifestyle. They want a short-term solution to get them by to the next night of sleep. That's the reason why the Dave Asprey's, the Mark Sissons, the Richard Bransons, all the guys selling nootropics, David Sinclair, all those guys. That's why there's a marketplace for them. What am I trying to do? I told you in the beginning of this podcast, Buckminster Fuller, burn them fucking all down. Burn them down. Start anew, teach people about nature, teach people about how we really work. When they do that, I believe that people, at least half the population, has enough dopamine left to say, you know what, I'm going to give this a try. I'm going to give crazy a try. I'm going to go take my shoes off. I'm going to look at the sun every day. I'm going to increase my melanin over 6, 7, 8 weeks, and I'm going to see what happens. With no supplements, no nothing. Come back and tell me how you do. Tell me how crazy I am then. I'm okay with that biohack. Didn't cost you anything. All it cost you was maybe a little time listening to a conversation between two mammals across the pond who both happen to have the same degree. That's all you wasted.
Yeah, well, off the back of that, I truly do appreciate your time and all of the things that we've discussed. I was going to, at one point I was thinking, is the podcast going to be called From the NHS to Noether's Theorem? And we got there in the end, you said it. Jack's right, the simplest thing is that seeing the sunrise with your bare feet on the ground is one of the simplest things that you can do for your health. And based on the food story that you told, I've just, again, inspired by you, I've just invested in there's a new regenerative sustainable farm project near where I live. And they have a vision to kind of cultivate 100 farms over the UK that are run in a decentralized way, which should be super interesting. And yeah, I think it's going to go somewhere. I was going to ask you to talk about, I was just going to ask you to talk about one of your cases, which was the one that involved McDonald's. Because it interests me, and because of my co-host Richard has developed a retreat. He calls it Movement Ayahuasca, where he basically has found patterns, and he's been working with a lot of people over a long period of time, where certain muscle groups seem to hold on to specific traumas or behaviors or memories. And he's created workouts where he's allowed people to...
But that's Montagnese stuff. That makes total sense when you understand a haptic transmission.
Yeah, I told him when I saw it happen that this is going to be a really challenging thing to get into a centralized scientific journal and explain all of this. But
Well, you
if
got
any,
more chance now, Eddie, to do it, because now that people know that ketamine, psilocybin, LSD actually have amazing effects on people that have really melanin problems and tryptophan problems.
yeah,
I think you got a better shot now than you would have if when I was young. I mean, that this was totally taboo. Now I think there's an opening for you. It may not be right here, right now, but I think you could get it published somewhere. I think people are very interested in this.
do you think the memories are in the water of the muscle,
I do.
or the heart, or wherever they're stored?
I think if you were asking me to guess, and it's purely speculation on my part, I actually think Montagnier's studies that he did in 2009 and 2015, they're absolutely the most fascinating experiment, as far as I'm concerned, done to date. Because one of the things that I have built out in my theory, like the edge of my science goes all the way up to neutrinos and antineutrinos. And that's like the seventh level of energy production. I mean, melanin is like the third. So there's four other levels that we haven't even got to.
Yeah.
And do I believe that what Montagnier has found is the sixth level, which is quantum entanglement and coherence? I believe that the melanin story is part of the quantum coherence story, and it has a lot to do with the physics. That's why I'm hoping guys like are in the UK, like Jim El Khalili, continue on the path they are with John Joy McFadden, where you have this cross-pollination of biology and physics. But do I believe your podcast cohort is onto something? I do. I would encourage them to continue to read, but I would encourage them, instead of just doing the execution, meaning doing the retreats is one thing, but I hope you start taking really big time histories of these people, looking at their melanation status. Because I'm going to tell you something that I've said, I think in another podcast, and I don't remember who the podcast was. Oh, I think I do. It was Sarah Pugh. I told her about an experience I had with mushrooms when I was a teenager. It had no effect on me at all. And I think the reason for that is because my brain has always had pretty good melanin in it. And I fundamentally believe that these medications help people who have very poor melanin renovation in their body. And that's where I think it helps. And if you think about like just the word we use, mushrooms, hopefully this will stimulate you and your partner. Think about what mushrooms fundamentally are in a forest. They're a place that collects all the bad mojo, and these things grow out of the ground. So what is it doing? It's regenerative recycling of the soil for photosynthesis. And not only that, the interesting thing is, this is the reason why mushrooms are still loaded with vitamin D. So vitamin D and melanin, that story is there. Remember how I talked about the story in our skin? When you start to see this, and then you see the fractal in nature, in a forest, and you begin to realize what's really happening here. It's an atomic recycling story. And the use of these drugs, I think actually helps some of these people recycle some of the bad atoms that are in them, and rebuild some of these non-optical linear programs that are in us. Now, do I think they can solve the problem? No. I think they're salve on a wound. But when you consider how bad, some of these things are for patients, especially in your business, this better than me, because your profession and my specialty, we're on kind of opposite ends of the spectrum of that. Even though we both deal with brain issues, I would say you're the softer side and I'm the harder side. I look at it like it's mechanical. We put it together, take it apart. You're more interested in kind of how the flow of the whole system works. I can tell you now that I'm older, I'm probably more on your side than not, because I realize that the tens gritty portion of the neurologic system actually can't operate without this water side, and without understanding how the semiconductors in between create, the story of, good cognitive function and good mental function. So I don't deride what your partner's doing. In fact, I think it's smart, but I think you guys need to do really good history taking on the people that have a bad trip and a good trip, because I really believe that you're going to find, just like I found with melanosis coli and melasma on the face, that there's a story there about the patient that you just learned. In other words, it's another part of your H&P that's not written on the chart, that you will be able to harvest information and say, man, I get this. And I think the way in which they respond too is also important, because I think it'll be somatotopically organized all the way back to the neural crest, and how and the egg they came from. That's how crazy I think this power is. And when you think about that, the beautiful part, like I'm thinking about Ted Achozo now, he would love this, because basically what I'm saying there is this is the cosmic wand of the universe going all the way through us, all the way into, us, and even our offspring, or even our friends. Because I believe, to be honest with you, I think this process that you guys are talking about, this is why you have the network of friends that you have. It's the reason why you interact with people the way you do. I think that cosmic wand really is talking through us. And if the antenna is broken, and through the ayahuasca trip, you're adding things back to make the antenna have a better fidelity so they can connect with that cosmic wand. I mean, Rick calls it the source code. I like to call it the sun, but be very clear here. Do I believe that we are affected by extraterrestrial radiation? I'm talking about cosmic rays from other galaxies. The answer is yes, I do, because there's no way we couldn't be, if you understand the way the system's connected, and the real connection there, so people don't think this is woo. I told you melanin absorbs all frequencies of the electromagnetic spectrum. There's your answer right there, why I believe that what I just said has some scientific validity.
Yeah. I don't know if I've lost you.
No, I'm still here.
Oh, you're still there. Good. Yeah, super interesting. The benefit is of the approach. There's no exogenous substances taken. It's purely movement and breathing, and we try and do it outdoors as much as we can, which I think is a message for our fitness community who listen. Is again, something you've said about Peter Attia is putting a lot of mitochondrial density in your muscles may not be the best move, and particularly doing it indoors under blue light in gyms is
actually raises your LDL cholesterol. That's the reason he wants to put people on statins. I mean, it's just psychotic when you think about it. But the movement people get mad at me too, because they always interpret kind of what I say with religious fervor, that I say that exercise doesn't matter. That's not what Uncle Jack's saying. Exercise matters, but you need to understand that exercise sits between the afferent and efferent limbs of the central nervous system. And it turns out that your brain is where all the melanin story is. So if you have poor melanin renovation, exercise can be a toxin. It's the same reason I've said that a cucumber eaten in the UK on December 31st is a toxin. Sounds crazy on the surface, but when you realize that cucumber that you bought in the grocery store came from Chile in the Southern Hemisphere and not from the UK, and you're eating it on December 31st, you're basically getting a deuterium bomb when the sun is only out from, say, 8 o'clock in the morning to 3:30. And then you think about what you and I have talked about the first 2 hours of this podcast, you're like, I kind of never thought about it that way, that healthy food can be a toxin. And the same reason is why good exercise can also be a toxin.
Yeah. And we would agree. We're very, part of the research I'm doing is trying to protocolize these in terms of, I'm very interested in lactate and lactate responses to stress, because again, another story that got waylaid for a long time, that lactate was this terrible waste product of metabolism, and now it connects every cell in us by, again, something I've learned from yourself is it's it's deuterium depleted because it's gone through glycolysis, so then it can enter the TCA cycle without having to go through that process again.
Correct.
The one thing a lot of people, I mean, I asked my community whether they had any specific questions. One that stands out, I think a lot of people ask this, is how can somebody leverage the magnetism leg of the stool with small hacks on a daily basis? And I don't necessarily think
that's easy. That's the easiest question you've asked me so far.
Go ahead.
So if you go back to the periodic table hack, that's quantum engineering 41 and 42. What's one of the things I said in that blog? All free radicals are paramagnetic. What does that mean? So what's the easiest way for you to get paramagnetism in the UK right now, your community? There's a famous dermatologist from Edinburgh, 59th latitude, wrote a paper about nitric oxide and blood pressure. So UVA light, get outside, you make more of it. To get to your story about lactate, how do you tie it together? Realize that when you're hypoxic, changes the oxidation state of iron and hemoglobin and every heme-based semiconductor inside you. Realize that story is important. So oxygenation inside, how did we say that it manifests? I told you the story about nitric oxide being a free radical. What happens to hydrogen peroxide when it's put in aqueous solution? Turns into H2O and oxygen. Again, another story. Remember what happens when you bring oxygen in? What does it do? It recycles hydrogen and NAD positive. If you're doing that, are you making lactate? No, you don't need it. In other words, you're not hypoxic. What's the other part of the story? UV light stimulates melanin. What did we say earlier in this podcast? It breaks down to H plus, oxygen, and electrons. Another way to make oxygen. Okay, what else happens? When a tree in Hyde Park gets hit with light right now on May 20th, that UV light makes more oxygen than it will in February. So guess what? Plants make more of the oxygen. You have mitochondria that absorb it. When you start to think about this, you start going, okay, this oxygen story is a big deal. Then you go back to Alexander Wunsch's thing. That keeps our dopamine in our frontal lobes. What did I tell you about dopamine before? Controls skeletal muscle type, right? That's actually how you're able to be Usain Bolt. That's the reason why there's not a lot of English guys that are going to challenge Usain Bolt. There's also not a lot of English guys that are going to win the Boston Marathon because the Kenyans do. You're beginning to understand why they train in Nairobi at 1 degree north latitude at 8,000 feet. They are basically photo adapted to the perfect environment to optimize performance of their muscles. I've even gone even further with this. I know you guys call football soccer. We call soccer. But American football, if you look at it's getting more popular in England. You look at the top 20 rushers in NFL history, this all-time rushers, you know what you find? Every single one of them but one is from low latitude in the United States. And guess what? There's a reason for that. Remember, these guys get injured, but the guys are the best, all come. So the number one guy is Emmitt Smith. Where is he from? Pensacola, Florida. 28th latitude. Where did he go to school? Florida. It's like stunning. Like I talk about Walter Payton, Jackson, Mississippi. Only one guy breaks the rules. So when you talk about the workout community, Uncle Jack's not anti-workout. Uncle Jack is workout outside. Stay outside the gym. Do not look, Peter Addy the other day on his Instagram account was doing one of these heavy workouts, and on the towel was blood. He got a spontaneous nosebleed. Let me ask you something, Eddie. You studied my work enough. You think that blue light in the gym had a problem with his phenolpalatine artery in his nose from melanopsin, and maybe that's why it happened while he was increasing his cerebral metabolic rate and his blood pressure? You think any of those things? But this is a guy that just wrote a book about longevity, and he's supposed to be looked at as a rock star. And just because his outside looks really good his nose bleeds when he works out. But me, because I'm a fatter guy and I don't do the stuff he does, but my brain works way better than his does, I'm looked at not as the guru. It's amazing to me that we look at a facade of something and say, well, that's optimal health. No, it's no longer survival of the fittest, my friend. In a world that's blue lit, filled with RF radiation, it's survival of the wisest. Where you bury your mitochondria, right here and right here. That's my message to the workout community. Focus in on that. If you focus in on the brain, you will optimize your skeletal muscle system the way it's built by nature. And if you've read the Patreon blogs, you know what I've said. And you will know what I said in the coming blogs. Why ACTH and POMC turns off growth hormone. We are not designed to be gorillas. We're not. Our mitochondrial density had to be turned off. And all that goes back to because where we put deuterium to make a slight bend in the notochord. That's how it happened. And when you see it for yourself, you'll go, okay, I got it. I just need to work outside in Hyde Park. You know, the guy, I always tell the meatheads that were in Venice Beach, California, I have zero problems with them. The problem is most of them were using exogenous steroids, which was not good. But the point being taken, I have zero problems with people working outside. One of my good friends, Erwin LaCour, runs a company called Moving At. He takes everybody, all different parts of the world, and gets them to move in nature. It's the best exercise in the world. He's a brilliant guy. I wish more people would follow him. But no, if your friends that listen to this podcast are going to train humans in a blue lab, I am going to burn their whole paradigm down. Exactly what they're doing, Eddie, is exactly what I do when I have to open up someone's head and put a xenon bulb microscope in there. I know what I'm doing, but I don't have any other way to take that brain tumor or clip that aneurysm, but use that bulb. Why? Because Zeiss doesn't make a microscope with a red bulb on it.
Well, you mentioned, I think, in a previous podcast that you were friends with Charles Poliquin, and maybe he's a prime example of somebody that fell on that sword.
Not only that, he knew. You know, if you listen to, you know, things he wrote and things he said, he knew. But he was like, I don't think it's going to happen to me. And, you know, he had a family history too. And I was like, dude, this whole blue light thing is a big deal for you to pay attention to. But, you know, the funny thing, Eddie, is there's so many people, especially like on Instagram and social media, that say, well, Jack, if you're right, how come, you know, you don't look like Michelangelo's David? I said, well, let me flip this around. How come you haven't figured out what I figured out? Why are you such a fucking dumbass? See, when I say it like that, it sounds harsh. But the thing is, when people say the opposite way, it doesn't sound harsh. You know why? Because that's what your cognitive bias is built towards. You know? And when you understand the story of POMC, maybe you begin to understand there are certain parts of your physiology that I think you really want to optimize. And ultimately, this is one thing that Peter Addy and I agree on. We're getting taken out by brain and heart diseases, okay? Last time I checked, we were not getting taken out by biceps and Achilles tendons, okay? So focusing in on optimizing them absolutely is fucking psychotic, okay? And anybody who tells you that optimizing the muscle skeletal system is a way to longevity, which is actually the message that's in Peter Attia's book, then tell me why the people that are supercentenarians don't look like that. See, that's where reality doesn't meet the practice.
On the topic of tendons, I think you talked about collagen in one of your last
Instagram post.
It was Instagram post. I was interested the mechanism by which ciprofloxacin, being an antibiotic that's known to cause tendon ruptures. I wonder if you've ever thought about the mechanism and why that happens.
I did a podcast on the mechanism why. If you look at my fluoride podcast, all fluoroquinolones have fluoride in. What does fluoride do? It's the most electronegative atom on the periodic table. So this falls right into your neck of the woods. If you're electronegative, you hold on to electrons. If you're run by a semiconductor, do you want all your electrons stuck in a fluoride atom? No, because then you block the flow. If you block the flow, what does that say by Becker's work? No regeneration. So collagen fails. And that's the reason why these people get tendon ruptures. Fluoride is a really bad actor. And the reason it's not used in biology is because of what I told you. We work by semiconduction. It's a small atom, so it means it's extremely electronegative. The only atom that we really use, the two electronegative atoms, is chloride and oxygen. Oxygen is about as far down the path as we go because we need to pull the electron from cytochrome 1. But also oxygen has another effect that makes it most effective. It's paramagnetic. Well, we're back to that story again. So it's drawn to magnetic fields, and that's the reason why mitochondria generate a magnetic field. Fluoride, if for anybody who wants to listen, I did a podcast, I believe, in 2017, 2018 that you can find on the internet. A lot of people don't know that I used to be a dentist before I was a neurosurgeon, so I know a lot about fluoride. Fluoride is a bad actor, and it goes all the way back to the story with Rockefeller. He had to figure out a way to get rid of fluoride, and when the United States government broke up Standard Oil, he said that he would ultimately figure out a way to bankrupt the United States. Well, guess what? That's why you got water fluoridation, and that's also why Big Pharma puts fluoride in drugs. It's the number one way for you to get fluoride is through products that man makes. That should be a story for you. Anything that blocks mitochondrial respiration effectively makes you hypoxic. What did we say earlier, Eddie, in this podcast to connect the dots for the doctors listening to this? When you're hypoxic, what happens to melanin sheets? They break down, don't they? So then you need melanin renovation. What's the solution to the fluoride problem? Magic, right? Get out in the sun. See, the thing is, when you understand this from this 80,000-foot framework, you begin to see how all the pieces fit. I mean, when I went to Vermont and I started my talk in 2018, I actually started with the Tool song. And the reason I started with Tool is because I said, if you listen to the lyrics, when you're a neurosurgeon, you see all the pieces fit because I've seen them fall apart. I've seen them fall apart in every single one of my patients. And you're a physician, you've seen brains fall apart in front of you. You may not have understood actually how they fell apart, but I guarantee you, even before this podcast, you had a pretty good clue what was going on. But after talking to me for 2.5 hours, you're probably like, now I'm starting to see other parts of this story. Like, now I understand why Jack said the implications of that discussion between 3 mammals in Malibu the first week of March might have some big implications for the rest of the world. What am I trying to do with you now? I'm trying to spread that virus to the UK. I want everybody up there to know why I hate London. It's not because I dislike you guys, and it's not King George from 1774. It's because you don't have enough sun for me to like it. I need a constant source of melanin renovation, especially when I'm still doing trauma call. I'm actually on trauma call night right now. And I know that that's killing me. But guess what? There's a reason I got to do it. And that reason is what it is. And we go from there. The bottom line is, don't worry about what I'm doing. Worry about what I'm trying to teach you. Worry about the message.
Yeah, that's the that's the important part. I was going to finish by asking you, you mentioned, I think you said it to Rick, that you pay attention to sampling, or you spread messages through light, through seeing people's faces, their hands, things like that.
Say it again.
You pay attention to sampling people's faces and the light that they're putting across. And this idea of kind of quantum sampling in my head is interesting.
Sorry about that. My phone's going off, so it's probably the ER.
No problem. We can wrap up after this. I was just thinking, do you interact with people in a certain way and avoid speaking and being around certain people as well?
Yeah, can you hold on a minute? I got to take this because it's the ER.
No problem.
the question. Yeah, when when you have, like what we're doing right now, we have an ambient awareness of each other through the internet. So you're not getting the full effect of Jack Kruse. When you're in the room, you are actually have the ability inside you to sense the endogenous semiconductors leak through my fingers, my hands, my face. So the emotion, the impact, the inflection, it actually has a greater impact. It's kind of like, the way I like to describe it is put a podcast on and turn the video off, and then listen to the same podcast with the video on. You'll notice that the video on has a bigger impact when you're listening to it. And it's the same thing that holds true, with conversations. When I said to Huberman, because he's a visual researcher, he knows a lot of this stuff. We even have places in our brain that pay attention to the human face and different faces and emotions. I mean, we are very, very in tune to that. We are truly a social primate. So you have that ability through the non-visual photoreceptor system. Neuropsin and melanopsin are paying attention to all of this. So you have a deeper connection. And that's immediately why you find out when you're with somebody, whether you're into them or not. Every single one of us have had a visual or a visceral response to someone when you meet them. Like, you'll say, well, I thought you were an asshole on the internet, but now when I'm meeting you, I've kind of got a totally different idea about you. And, since Ted's the perfect one for you to ask, say, well, what's it like to talk to Jack and hang out with Jack? Because, I hung out with Ted down in Florida, and then I spent, almost 5 days with him in the Philippines when he had me come over there to try to teach doctors what you and I are talking about right now. And I think that impact, when you're one-to-one, is radically different than when you're doing it across technology. I think technology, it's kind of like what I said to you before. We're losing the edge in medicine by allowing centralized medicine to put the EMR between us and our patients. I think doctors need to fight much harder against EMRs. Do I think that's going to happen? No, because I think modern doctors are, I'll piss them off when I say this. I don't think they're as good as we used to be in the old days when it was more mono e mono. And, they don't understand why I say it, but in large part, it has to do with the use of technology. And when you consider that the use of technology has had no benefit in terms of progress in medicine, the question you got to ask yourself is, why are we using it? I can tell you the answer. It's because the bean counters want us to use it, because that's how they make money.
Yeah, well, I think as well, the doctors are becoming, as you've said before, burnt out very rapidly, and the energy that they have to fight is dwindling, and it concerns me. And that's part of the reason I moved to an academic position for the moment, but I'm still in an institute under blue lights for the majority of the day. Hopefully I'm going to be in Florida with Ted in October time, so I don't know if you hang around there much these days. But
yeah, I go to Florida, but my go-to right now has been El Salvador.
Sure.
Further south. See, when I'm killing myself in the ER, like you just heard me answer that phone call, so when I do have off, I need to go to the 13th north latitude to really recharge.
And is that just because of the UV index being that much higher?
Well, it's not only much higher. There's other reasons for going down there. They also have Bitcoin as legal tender. And if you understand Bitcoin, it's a decentralized network that, kind of screws governments, and anything that screws a government and breaks centralized medicine, Uncle Jack is all about. So you can tell your colleagues, if they're listening to this, tell them to buy some Bitcoin, because
I do.
It's totally linked to the mitochondrial or mitochondriac story that, I'm building.
Jack, is there anything else you can say to round things off?
Well, I think we said a lot. I think, a lot of the things that Warren said between the words between me, Rick, and Huberman, I actually said to you. I think this will be eye-opening to probably a lot of physicians. Hopefully it'll be eye-opening to a lot of the public that sees this. so that they begin to realize there's levels that have not even been tapped between you and your doctor. And I still maintain that change, the first question you asked me, change will not come from within. Change will come from outside, and patients need to understand they can help facilitate the change by getting their doctors to change, listening to a podcast like this, and understanding the limitations of the system put limitations on us. There's things that we can't do as physicians that only the patients can. But if the patients ask us the right questions, we have a duty to tell them the truth. That's all that has to be done. Remember, the truth can be told in an operatory between you and your patient. It doesn't have to be documented in a chart. So when I tell people about mammalian sphinxing, when I talk to people about the sun, I just had a discussion this morning with a patient when I made rounds about how the sun would reduce her pain, and she was stunned about that. A nurse happened to be in the room. Normally, I don't let the nurses in the room when I say it. Today, I said, fuck it. Why? Because I think everybody needs the explanation. I told her how red light impacts it. I actually relayed that to you in this podcast. So I think the implications of that podcast, hopefully the implications of this podcast, is that people begin to realize the truth needs to come out. And there's a famous saying out there that the truth always comes out when the sun's out. Put sunshine on the bullshit, and all of a sudden the truth will fizzle out. And I think if you listen to the 2.5 hours that you and I put in the can, I think people will come to that conclusion. And I don't want anybody to listen to this and think they should take everything I said as gospel. I want you to examine what I said, do your own due diligence, and then decide, is this more likely than not directionally accurate, or is it total bullocks? And if you don't think it is, then you have a duty as either the patient or the clinician to jump down the rabbit hole and look a little deeper. See the things you might have missed. See the things you weren't paying attention to. Put some Windex on your glass eyes.
I think, as you say, a good thing to do is if you get more sun, you'll soon realize that you feel better, and then go from there. You might think.
You'll also see a lot better. You'll see both the seen and the unseen around you. Your perception will expand.
Well, on that note of expanding perceptions, I think we will leave it there and say farewell to the listeners. So thanks everybody for listening, and hopefully we'll have more conversations soon, Jack.
All right. Take care, Eddie. It was good talking with you.